Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening, everyone. The story I'm about to share isn't mine, but belongs to the parents of my closest friend. They're serious people who wouldn't fabricate something just for attention. A devoted older couple, passionate about travel and exploration, who invest every penny and moment exploring this vast country and its cultural treasures. For them, traveling and savoring local delicacies is their greatest joy at this stage of life. This particular time, they decided to leave our quiet mountain town and head toward the coast, specifically to the enchanting shores of Cape May in New Jersey. The plan was straightforward. Enjoy a peaceful day with another couple who were longtime friends, sharing lunch and soaking up the beach, perhaps returning home by sunset. Retired and unhurried, they spent the entire day chatting, dining, and appreciating the scenery. When night fell, they decided it would be wiser to stay overnight in the town and continue their journey the next morning. They found a charming Victorian-era bed and breakfast in the heart of Cape May's historic district. Upon arriving at the reception desk, my friend's father asked, "Good evening. Do you have 2 rooms available?" The clerk, with a weary and impatient air, responded curtly, as if trying to discourage them. "Only rooms 24 and 26 remain." Ignoring her attitude, they accepted the offer. Each couple headed to their respective rooms, bidding farewell in the hallway before settling in for the night. However, my friend's father experienced a restless night. Whenever he opened his eyes, he found comfort in seeing his wife sleeping peacefully beside him. But then something made him blink rapidly to ensure he was truly seeing what appeared before him. Standing before the mirror was a young woman dressed in an elaborate wedding gown, gazing at herself calmly. She began to move, gliding across the room with a smile on her face, seemingly unaware of their presence. Despite the unusual situation, he felt no fear. With the composure of someone experienced and clear-headed, he whispered a prayer that this figure, whether spirit or something else entirely, would find peace. When he opened his eyes again, he watched the woman vanish, passing through the wall as if it didn't exist. Without any possible explanations, he understood he had witnessed something extraordinary. The following morning in the bed and breakfast's dining room, while they were having breakfast, it was his friend's wife who mentioned something first. "I might have dreamed this, but I believe I saw a woman in our room. She wore a flowing white gown, like a bride, and appeared to walk through the wall toward your room. I woke my husband, but she had already disappeared." My friend's father smiled, feeling more confident, and shared what he had also seen that night. As the occupants of rooms 24 and 26 discussed the night's events, several staff members, overhearing their conversation, approached with a hint of knowing smirk. "And how was your night? Did you sleep well?" Both couples shared their experiences, but what caught their attention was the complete lack of surprise on the employees' faces. Oh, of course, the only rooms available were the bridal suite rooms. One staff member stated matter-of-factly, as if this were common knowledge. Yet at no point had anyone mentioned this before. How could they have known? It became clear that other guests had witnessed the same phenomenon. Seeing the curiosity in the couple's faces, the staff led them to a parlor room filled with antique photographs from when the building had been the residence of a prominent local family. It was there they saw her, the young woman from the photograph, wearing the exact same wedding dress. Without hesitation, they pointed to her as they listened with heavy hearts to the story the staff recounted. According to local legend, this woman had been murdered on her wedding day. Since then, she remained bound to the happiest moment of her life, still wearing the dress she never had the chance to change out of. The couples returned home carrying a tale to share, accounts that would surely be passed down to their children, and even to people like me, fascinated by all that is enigmatic and inexplicable. Their journey had given them more than beautiful coastal views. It had given them a brush with the otherworldly that would stay with them forever. The old Victorian bed and breakfast still stands today, welcoming guests who may or may not encounter the bride who continues her eternal wait. Some say on quiet nights, particularly during the autumn months when the sea winds howl, you can hear the rustle of silk taffeta and see a shadow in white passing through the walls of rooms 24 and 26. My friend's parents never returned to Cape May, but the story lived on. They spoke of it carefully, guardedly, aware that some things in this world defy explanation. In hushed tones around dinner tables, they would recount how a peaceful seaside getaway became a window into something far beyond our understanding. A reminder that sometimes the veil between worlds grows thin, and those who witness it are forever changed. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I was just 14 years old when my father passed away, and there were two incidents that have haunted me ever since. He was only 48, in excellent physical condition. He ran marathons, played basketball with the neighborhood guys, and rarely ever got sick. In fact, the only time he'd been to the hospital was for a sprained ankle when he was coaching my soccer team. His death came completely out of nowhere. That Thursday morning, Dad was in the garage working on his motorcycle like he always did. Mom had made his favorite breakfast, pancakes with blueberries, and called him in around 9 o'clock. They ate together while watching the morning news. Everything seemed perfectly normal until he suddenly said he could hear drums beating upstairs. Mom thought it was odd since it was just the two of them at home and no one was playing music. He asked her to check, but when she went upstairs, there was nothing but silence. Throughout the morning, he kept insisting he heard those drums. Each time Mom investigated, she found only empty rooms and quiet hallways. Around noon, he mentioned hearing what sounded like horses galloping through the backyard. Once again, Mom looked outside. There were no horses, no hoof prints, nothing unusual at all. She suggested maybe it was kids playing next door, but he shook his head and said these sounds were different, almost otherworldly. They decided to watch television to distract him, settling in the living room to catch up on an old Western movie. About 20 minutes into the film, Mom asked Dad if he wanted more coffee, but he didn't answer. She turned to look at him and realized he was clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. She called 911 immediately, but by the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. The heart attack had been massive and sudden. At the funeral, Mom told everyone about the strange sounds Dad had heard that morning. Many of our relatives, especially the older ones, believed these were signs, omens warning of what was to come. The preacher that we'd known since I was a baby said sometimes, "The spirit world sends us messages. We don't always understand." Here's where things get truly bizarre. My parents were both deeply religious people, devout Methodists who attended services every Sunday. My younger sister was their golden child, active in youth group and Sunday school. But Dad and we were the black sheep of the family. I'd stopped going to church at 12, and Dad privately admitted to me that year that he no longer believed in any of it. We had an agreement. When his time came, there would be no prayers, no religious ceremony. Just a simple memorial service. That Sunday afternoon, as we gathered at the funeral home, one of Dad's old army buddies started reciting the Lord's Prayer as they prepared to close the casket. Mom looked at me apologetically. She knew about Dad's wishes, but didn't have the heart to stop his friend from paying respects in his own way. I nodded that it was okay and stepped outside to get some air. In the parking lot, my Uncle Jerry was getting Dad's pickup truck ready. Dad had always driven it to work, and we planned to use it to follow the hearse to the cemetery. It was a 1987 Ford with manual locks. No fancy electronics, just simple mechanical parts. As I watched Jerry check the tires, something impossible happened. The moment I heard more voices join in the prayer from inside the building. Every door on that truck slammed shut and locked simultaneously. Jerry and I looked at each other in disbelief. He tried his key, the one Dad had given him years ago for emergencies. Nothing. We tried the spare key Mom kept in her purse. Still locked tight. We pulled on the handles, pushed buttons, tried everything we could think of. Other family members came out to help, thinking maybe the old truck was just being stubborn. But no amount of force could budge those doors. Then, as soon as the praying stopped, and we heard Aunt Susan say, "Amen," through the open door, every lock popped open with a distinct click. Uncle Jerry crossed himself, something I'd never seen him do before. Even I, the skeptic, felt my heart racing. It was like Dad was sending us a message, crystal clear. No prayers, just like we'd agreed. Despite this, we never told the people inside to stop. Their intentions were good, even if Dad wouldn't have approved. To this day, that truck incident is something we can't explain. Everyone who witnessed it has their own theory, but none of us have found a logical explanation that makes sense. But the weirdness didn't end there. About a week before Dad passed, our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Richardson, confided something strange to my mother. She'd been putting out her trash bins one evening around 10 o'clock when she noticed a figure standing at the end of our driveway. She described a tall man, unusually tall, dressed in a black suit with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He was just standing there, motionless, staring directly at our house. The streetlight cast strange shadows, making his whole appearance seem distorted and unnatural. What unsettled her most was that the figure remained perfectly still for several minutes before simply walking away into the darkness. At the time, we didn't think much of her story. Maybe it was someone lost or confused. But years later, when horror movies and internet stories about the Slenderman started becoming popular, my sister called me breathlessly to point out the similarity. The timing made it even more chilling, if Mrs. Richardson's mysterious visitor was somehow connected to Dad's death. None of us wanted to admit what that might mean. These experiences left our family forever changed. Mom still talks about the sounds Dad heard, the locked truck doors, and the strange figure outside our house. She says sometimes, in quiet moments, she can still hear faint drums beating, but only when she's thinking of him. Whether these were coincidences, premonitions, or something beyond our understanding, I'll never know. What I do know is that death, when it comes unexpectedly, often brings with it mysteries we're not equipped to unravel. This story is based on a true event that occurred in Providence, Rhode Island, in the fall of 2007. I've lived through many strange and unsettling situations, but today I'm sharing the one I consider the most haunting and terrifying. Back then, I was living in the Federal Hill neighborhood, and everything happened while we were moving within the same area. The new house stood on a corner lot, and directly across from it was nothing but an abandoned plot overgrown with weeds. On the first night, we started moving furniture and belongings. We couldn't get everything organized. We decided I would stay at the new house with what had already been transported. My friend Miguel, who was helping us move, stayed with me. Since we didn't have a bed yet, we spread a blanket in the living room and spent time talking and sharing old stories. The house was peculiar. It had a front porch and an iron gate that had fallen off its hinges. To enter, you had to lift and drag the gate across the ground. From the very beginning, the night felt off. The place had an intimidating atmosphere that reminded me of a horror movie set 2 stories, completely empty, which made it even more sinister. Miguel seemed restless, unable to relax. After some time, he said he needed to use the bathroom. The powder room downstairs had no running water yet, and the upstairs bathroom had no electricity. I suggested he grab the lighter from the kitchen to find his way. I joked that I could accompany him if he was afraid. He laughed but seemed tense as he climbed the stairs. Meanwhile, I laid back down and dozed off for about 20 minutes. That's when I heard the gate scraping against concrete and the front door opening. I sat up immediately and saw Miguel running down the street. No matter how much I called out, he didn't even look back. I locked the house and went straight to where my family was staying at the old place to tell them what happened. My father, skeptical, suggested maybe we'd been drinking, but I assured him we were completely sober. The matter was eventually dropped. The next day, we finished the move and began living in the new house. Me, my parents, and my 2 siblings. From the start, that place seemed to carry a heavy energy, much worse than the previous house, where I'd already experienced some strange occurrences. Sometime later, my mother began mentioning that inexplicable things were happening. Objects would change places. Doors would open on their own. It was during a weekend trip to a farm with friends that I ran into Miguel again. He seemed different, as if avoiding my gaze or conversation. When we finally exchanged a few words, he revealed that night at the house, he'd seen a shadow in the upstairs bedroom by the window. He also said that when he came downstairs, he couldn't find me and scared, he left. I suspected he wasn't telling me everything, but chose not to press the issue and just made light of the situation. At the farm, we were seeking adventure and thrills, since the place was known for ghost stories. At one point, we thought we heard something strange. One friend, visibly intoxicated, began challenging any supernatural presence that might be there. Suddenly, we saw the silhouette of an elderly woman in the distance. That was the climax of our exploration. After that, we agreed to continue the night at my house, drinking beer. However, after that experience, only a few friends accepted the invitation, including Miguel. Perhaps emboldened by the alcohol, we were sitting in the living room, drinking and recounting stories from the farm, when we heard a noise at the gate. I went to check and noticed it was open, even though no one had entered. I found it odd, but didn't think much of it. In the meantime, Miguel went to the bathroom, and I got the idea to play a prank on him. I suggested to another friend that he hide. The two of us positioned ourselves and waited for Miguel's reaction. When he asked for our friend and again we heard the gate scraping, I seized the moment, tried to act scared, and opened the door. Miguel, suspicious, followed me outside. What happened next marked our lives forever. Outside, toward the wall that was about 6 feet tall, we saw something unbelievable. A head appeared above the wall, something massive, grotesque, like a monster. The creature had horns, a distorted face that resembled a horse, but with a demonic appearance. We froze, unable to move, as we watched this being shake its head from side to side at an inhuman speed. Terror seized us completely, and screaming, we leaped away. Our other friend, who was in the kitchen, appeared crying, and my father came down the stairs angry, demanding to know what was happening. We tried to tell him what we saw, but he didn't believe us, thinking we were just drunk. Annoyed, he went back to his room without helping us. My friends were shattered, in complete shock, not knowing how to act. We began to pray. We knew no one would believe what we had witnessed, and they refused to leave the house until dawn. In the following days, I tried to cope with the memories of that night. Once, when we were almost all gathered downstairs watching television, my older sister was visiting, and only my father was upstairs. My younger brother went up the stairs without saying a word. No one thought it was strange. A few minutes later, my brother-in-law decided to go to the upstairs bathroom, since the one downstairs was occupied. It wasn't even 2 minutes before we heard desperate screams, sounds of furniture being dragged, and my father's voice shouting. I ran upstairs, and what I saw devastated me. In the first bedroom, facing the window, my brother was hanging by a belt around his neck. My brother-in-law was holding him by the feet, trying to prevent the worst, while my father screamed, trying to make him respond. When my mother reached the second floor, she fainted. My sister and sister-in-law were crying and screaming in despair. I simply stood there, paralyzed, unable to do anything, just tears streaming down my face. He was younger than me, and the memory is still a wound that never healed. I have no doubt that evil exists. I've never shared this story elsewhere. Only some very close friends know, and if they hear this now, they'll remember what we went through. Other things happened in that house afterward, and for some reason, I ended up occupying that same bedroom. I carry with me the certainty that what we saw that night is directly related to what happened to my brother. I share this experience to warn others evil lurks closer than we imagine. Never challenge these energies by saying you'll only believe if you see it with your own eyes. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some doors are better left unopened. The price of curiosity can be far too high, as I learned in the most heartbreaking way possible. Last autumn, something happened to my grandmother that still keeps me awake at night. She lives alone in an old Victorian house in upstate New York, at the end of Maple Street, where it dead ends into the woods. Her bedroom is on the first floor with a set of French doors that open directly onto the porch and then to the street. These doors have a peculiar feature. They're fitted with one-way glass that my grandfather had installed back in the 60s. You can see out perfectly from inside the bedroom, but anyone standing on the porch sees only their own reflection. It was a Tuesday night, deep in October. Around 3:15 in the morning, my grandmother found herself unable to sleep. She'd been tossing and turning for hours, listening to the old house settle and creak. Finally, she got up and started pacing her bedroom, trying to wear herself out. That's when she first heard them. The Hendersons, two Great Danes barking from 3 houses down. Not their usual protective bark, but something more urgent, almost fearful. My grandmother paused by her window, listening as the barking grew louder, closer, as if something was moving up Maple Street toward her house. As the sound drew nearer, she noticed something odd. The Miller's little terrier mix, the one that barks at squirrels every morning, started making this high-pitched whining sound. Not aggressive, but terrified, like prey warning others of a predator, concerned that someone might be hurting the animals or trying to rob the neighbors. My grandmother positioned herself behind the French doors to look outside without being seen. What she saw made her blood run cold. There was a woman standing on her porch, but calling it a woman didn't feel right. The figure was barefoot despite the October chill, rail-thin with skin so pale it seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. She stood at an odd angle, hunched forward, arms wrapped around herself, as if fighting against invisible wind. The temperature in my grandmother's bedroom plummeted so suddenly she could see her breath. This figure's hair was long and dark, but twisted up in elaborate braids that formed an intricate pattern on top of her head, almost like a crown, but wrong somehow. Like Celtic knots tied by someone who'd forgotten how they were supposed to look. But the face, or lack thereof, was what truly frightened my grandmother. Where features should have been, there was only smooth skin. No eyes to meet, no mouth to speak, no expression to read. Just blankness. The dogs were going absolutely wild now. The Hendersons' Great Danes had reached the edge of their property, barking so hard their collars rattled. The terriers' whines had turned to desperate howls. Every dog on Maple Street was awake and alarmed. The figure remained eerily still on the porch, occasionally tilting its head as if trying to locate something through the cacophony of barking. Then it began to move. It swayed from side to side at first, testing the edges of the porch, moving toward the French doors, then backing away when the barking intensified. Like it was trying to find a path through an invisible barrier the dogs had created with their noise. My grandmother felt a strange compulsion rise within her, an almost overwhelming urge to unlock the doors and let the figure in. Part of her mind was screaming that this poor woman looked cold, looked lost, looked like she needed help. But another part, deeper, older, more primal, was warning her that this thing wasn't human, wasn't safe, wasn't meant to be invited inside. She gripped the door handle anyway, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from the war between compassion and instinct. The figure seemed to sense her conflict and moved closer to the glass, pressing one pale hand against it. The hand left no condensation, no fingerprints, nothing to prove it was really there. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my grandmother stood frozen, watching this faceless creature try to navigate past the wall of angry dogs. The figure would retreat a few steps, then attempt to approach again from a different angle, each time stopped by the renewed frenzy of barking. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, the figure stepped backward off the porch. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, almost gliding down the walkway to the street. It turned toward the woods at the end of Maple Street and disappeared between the trees. The barking stopped immediately, as if someone had flipped a switch. An unnatural silence settled over the neighborhood. When my grandmother told me this story the next day, I could hear the fear still trembling in her voice. I told her she'd made the right choice, not opening the door. We talked about old folklore, about spirits that appear at thresholds, about the wisdom of trusting one's gut feeling. Maybe the fact that you couldn't see its face was a mercy, I suggested. What if opening that door would have shown you something far worse than a blank face? She nodded slowly, then said something that still haunts me. You know what the strangest part was? When I looked down at the porch this morning, where it had pressed its hand against the glass, there was frost. But only there. Nowhere else. Just that perfect handprint of ice. Not long ago, I went through an experience that still keeps me up at night. I had just ended my first relationship at the age of 18. I had walked out of my parents' house to live with my boyfriend and stayed with him until I was 24. For the most part, life seemed fine, or at least I told myself it was. But during the last year, problems crept in like shadows at dusk, and a few months ago, we decided to part ways. The apartment we shared belonged to him. Everything was in his name: furniture, appliances, even the artwork on the walls. When I left, I took nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and memories I wished I could forget. My friend Katie became my lifeline. She didn't just offer sympathy. She opened her home to me, letting me crash on her couch while I pieced my life back together. For several weeks, I spent my days looking for work and my nights in her living room. Katie refused to let me wallow in self-pity. Every evening felt like a sleepover party from our college days. We'd watch movies, eat takeout, and she'd tell silly stories to distract me whenever she noticed tears forming in my eyes. She'd stay beside me until sleep finally came, and just as I drifted off, something peculiar would happen. Right before I fell completely asleep, I'd feel Katie's fingers running through my hair in gentle, soothing strokes. Then I'd sense something unusual, almost like she was not just touching my hair, but pressing it lightly between her fingers, maybe even nibbling on it. To me, it felt like a sisterly gesture, nothing inappropriate. It actually comforted me, made me feel less alone. I never asked her about it. It wasn't uncomfortable, quite the opposite. I felt cared for, protected. As weeks passed, I noticed something else. Almost every morning, I'd wake up without my socks. It happened so regularly that during breakfast one day, I mentioned how I preferred sleeping with socks on. Katie didn't respond. Maybe she hadn't heard me over the coffee maker. But even after that, I kept waking up barefoot. Then one evening, everything changed. Katie had gotten swamped with a project deadline. She called around 9 to say she'd be working late, and told me not to wait for her for dinner. I fixed myself a sandwich, put on a cheesy horror movie, and stretched out on the couch, trying to quiet my anxious thoughts. As drowsiness crept over me, I felt those familiar fingers gliding through my hair, followed by that strange pressing sensation. This time I heard heavy breathing very close to my face. Then I felt my socks being carefully pulled off my feet, followed by hurried footsteps rushing toward Katie's bedroom. I distinctly heard her closet door bang shut. For several minutes, I lay frozen, confused. I kept my eyes shut tight, convincing myself this had to be a dream. Maybe Katie had come home without me noticing, and my subconscious was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The familiar sound of Katie struggling with her apartment door lock jolted me fully awake. As usual, she burst in apologizing for working late and leaving me alone. I opened my eyes, disoriented. I looked down at my feet. The socks were gone again. I could still feel the sensation of fingers in my hair and that warm breath on my face. That's when the panic attack hit. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. It took me nearly half an hour to calm down enough to tell her everything. How night after night I'd felt those hands in my hair. How I always woke up without socks. Katie listened carefully and firmly denied doing any of it. She swore she'd never touched my hair or removed my socks. Desperate for answers, we searched her bedroom, checking the closet, under the bed, even behind furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. Fortunately, I moved out the next day as planned. Before leaving, Katie mentioned she'd never experienced anything strange in the apartment before, though she admitted she believed in the supernatural. About 6 months later, Katie called me with a story that sent chills down my spine. She'd been chatting with a neighbor in the building's elevator when he shared something bizarre. His 4-year-old daughter kept insisting that Katie didn't live alone. According to the little girl, a tiny old man lived in the apartment too. The child's description was unsettling. About 4'7", extremely thin, completely bald, with skin so dark it looked almost burned. The parents found it amusing, chalking it up to a child's vivid imagination. Looking for small talk, the neighbor thought he'd share this oddity with Katie. To Katie, the coincidence was terrifying. Since then, she can't stop wondering if what I experienced somehow connects to the child's vision. That's when I realized my peaceful nights had been anything but. Every time I close my eyes now, I wonder, what if that little girl was right? What if someone or something was watching me all along, running their fingers through my hair and stealing my socks? The thought still keeps me awake most nights. The letter, it was a quiet Sunday evening when the letter arrived. The moment I opened it, I felt drawn into someone else's nightmare. The words seemed to leap off the page, each sentence carrying the weight of unspoken horrors. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a descent into the abyss of human obsession. My name is Luna, and this is the story of how my mother's consuming envy led us down a path from which there was no return. We lived in a small fishing village on the coast of Maine, where icy Atlantic winds cut through summer like a knife. Every morning, my mother Alina and I ran our fish stand at the harbor market. The work was backbreaking, especially competing against Martha Collins, a vendor from the neighboring pier. Martha had loyal customers and pristine merchandise that put our slapdash operation to shame. My sister and I, focused on our studies at the community college, could only help on weekends, scrubbing down the stained wooden counter and clearing away flies that buzzed around day-old catch. Martha's stall gleamed like a showroom. Her fish lay on beds of crushed ice, eyes bright, scales iridescent. My mother's offerings wilted in comparison, fish with clouded eyes, tables sticky with brine. Even our efforts at cleanliness couldn't compete with Martha's obsessive attention to detail. Every day I watched customers walk past us, heading straight to Martha's stall. By mid-July, when summer tourists flooded the town, my mother's frustration reached a breaking point. A long-time customer bought his usual order from Martha instead of us. Something snapped inside my mother. "You're stealing my customers," she screamed, storming to Martha's stall. "They want quality, Alina." "That's not my fault," Martha replied coolly, her knife glinting in the morning sun. The argument exploded. Two market veterans faced off, surrounded by their merchandise. Fish flew through the air. Vegetables scattered across cobblestones. Screams echoed off brick buildings as they destroyed each other's stalls. When security finally separated them, a deep hatred had taken root, one that would poison everything it touched. From that day forward, my mother couldn't bear to hear Martha's name. She referred to her only as that woman, her voice dripping with venom. In desperation, my mother sought help from Madame Evangeline, an elderly Creole woman who lived in a weathered Victorian on the outskirts of town. Local whispers spoke of her knowledge of old magic, root work, they called it, passed down through generations. When she heard my mother's plan, Madame Evangeline agreed to teach her the rituals needed to drive Martha away. Perhaps she too harbored some grudge against Martha, because her fee was surprisingly low. On a night when nor'easter winds howled and waves crashed violently against the cliffs, my mother made her way to Madame Evangeline's house. The place felt wrong somehow. Shadows seemed to move independently, and strange symbols were carved into the woodwork. Madame Evangeline presented her with a crude poppet made of burlap and straw, its button eyes staring blindly. For the spell to work, she explained in her thick accent, you must have something personal from her. Hair, blood, or spittle. Cunning as always, my mother devised a plan. The next morning, she approached Martha in the market, feigning reconciliation. Though Martha rebuffed the peace offering, my mother successfully snatched a few strands of hair during their brief embrace. With trembling hands, she bound the hair to the poppet's neck. That night, under Madame Evangeline's watchful eye, my mother began the cursing ritual. Black candles dripped wax onto the kitchen table. An unfamiliar saint's statue seemed to observe from the corner. The air grew thick with burned herbs and melting wax. My sister Sarah and I huddled together, terrified but powerless to stop what was happening. "Repeat after me," Madame Evangeline intoned, her voice carrying an unnatural resonance. My mother's hands shook as she pushed pins into the poppet, first the arms, then the legs, finally the chest where the heart would be. With each pin, she recited words that sounded like broken glass. May her pain reflect mine. May her life extinguish like this flame. She blew out the candle, plunging us into absolute darkness. The days that followed brought disturbing news. Martha's niece Rachel, one of our few friends, reported that Martha had suddenly fallen ill. Headaches became migraines. Dizziness progressed to fainting spells. No doctor could diagnose the cause. Martha, once vibrant and energetic, withered before our eyes. Her sun-weathered skin turned gray and waxen. Meanwhile, our home became a place of terror. Shadows crawled across walls like living things. The air grew heavy, making each breath a struggle. Nightmares plagued Sarah and me. We'd wake screaming, sensing something malevolent watching from dark corners. Windows flew open without warning, icy winds rattling the old house to its foundation. Food spoiled overnight. Our pets, 2 dogs and 3 cats, died mysteriously, one after another. One night I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, the poppet before her, still whispering curses. I thought Madame Evangeline had taken it away, but here it was again, the black candle flickering eerily. The magic demands payment, Madame Evangeline had warned. If you're not willing to pay, the consequences will destroy you. But obsession had deafened my mother. The price, we learned, would be the lives of those she loved most. First our pets, then, with no other sacrifices available, Sarah and I. Martha's condition worsened daily. Her screams echoed through the village at night. Her body convulsed in agony. The shadows in our house grew bolder, taking on humanoid shapes with glowing eyes. Inhuman footsteps echoed through empty halls. Mirrors reflected distorted faces that vanished when we looked directly at them. 1 month after the ritual began, during another violent storm, Martha died. Her final screams carried on the wind, chilling everyone who heard them. While others mourned, my mother celebrated, seeing Martha's empty stall as her ultimate victory. But that same night, the terror intensified. The shadows transformed into grotesque creatures that advanced on us with predatory intent. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the house itself were alive. Soon after Martha's funeral, my mother developed the same symptoms that had killed her rival. Blinding headaches, burning fevers, violent convulsions. But worse was the constant feeling of being watched, followed, hunted by entities that grew stronger each day. Desperate, my mother tried to reverse the spell. But Madame Evangeline had vanished without a trace, her Victorian house standing empty, windows dark and door sealed. The end came swiftly. My mother's suffering surpassed anything Martha had endured. Her skin rotted while she still lived. She saw Martha's corpse in every corner, heard her voice in every creak of the house. Some nights, invisible hands would close around her throat. Other times, she'd run screaming through the house, fleeing from shapes only she could see. I witnessed one of these creatures myself, a tall, faceless shadow that leaned over her bed, whispering in a language that hurt to hear. Her scream that night shattered windows 3 houses down. 3 weeks after Martha's death, my mother followed her into the grave. Sarah and I were alone, surrounded by grief and the hungry presence that still lingered in our home. The haunting didn't end with my mother's passing. The house remained tainted, the shadows still moved, and sleep brought no peace. We sold everything and fled to Boston, hoping distance would break the curse. Years have passed. We've built new lives, found jobs, tried to forget. But some scars never heal completely. On certain nights, the shadows return in dreams. The voices echo in quiet moments. Though we escaped that cursed village, the spiritual and emotional marks remain, reminders of the terrible price of vengeance. The curse my mother unleashed that summer night hasn't entirely let us go. Even now, thousands of miles away, I sometimes wake to find a faceless shadow watching from the corner of my room, a reminder that some debts can never be fully repaid. It was just past midnight on July 4th, 2019. The fireworks had finally stopped exploding overhead, and my best friend Kyle's parents were out of town as usual. We'd finished celebrating Independence Day with a typical backyard bash, grilled burgers, cold beers, and enough patriotic decorations to make Uncle Sam proud. I'd crashed at Kyle's place plenty of times before, so I knew the drill. His old split-level house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by overgrown oak trees that kept the neighborhood kids away. Tonight, though, something felt different. Most everyone had left by 1 in the morning. Just me, Kyle, and his cousin Derek remained, lounging in the living room watching late-night infomercials. Derek was sprawled across the couch, fighting sleep after too many beers, while Kyle and I sat on the floor debating whether those magnetic bracelets actually worked. That's when we heard it, a distinct creaking sound coming from somewhere in the house. At first, we thought it was just the old pipes. Houses that age make all sorts of noises, especially in the summer heat. But this sound was rhythmic, almost musical. "Dude, what is that?" Kyle asked, holding up a hand to silence my rambling about the infomercial. The creaking continued, slow and steady. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, until we stood up and started moving around the room. As we crept toward the hall bathroom, the sound got louder. But passing it, we realized it wasn't coming from there either. Kyle's eyes widened. "It's coming from Mom's sewing room." I felt my stomach drop. That room had been locked since his grandmother passed away last spring. His mother couldn't bear to go through her things yet, so she'd simply closed the door and rarely spoke about it. "Maybe it's just the window," I suggested, trying to sound rational despite the alcohol making my head spin. "Did you check if it was latched before everyone came over?" Kyle shook his head. "Mom made sure everything was locked up before they left." The creaking persisted, hypnotic and unsettling. Without another word, Kyle grabbed a hammer from the garage, just in case, while I armed myself with a bottle opener from the kitchen counter. Looking back, we were probably too drunk to be wielding anything sharp, but fear has a way of making people do stupid things. Kyle turned the doorknob slowly. To our surprise, it wasn't locked. The old brass handle turned easily in his hand. The door swung open with a long, dramatic groan that sent a chill down my spine. The sewing room looked exactly as his grandmother had left it. Spools of thread lined the shelves, half-finished quilts lay folded on a side table, and an antique Singer sewing machine sat in the corner. But there, in the center of the room, was the source of the sound. An ancient rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth. The chair was massive, crafted from dark walnut with intricate carvings along the armrests. It had belonged to Kyle's great-grandmother, passed down through generations. His grandmother had spent countless hours in that chair, knitting scarves and telling stories about their family history. We stood frozen in the doorway, watching the chair rock. There was no breeze, no reason for it to be moving. Kyle stepped forward carefully, extending the hammer toward the chair as if it might bite. "Wait," I whispered, grabbing his arm. But he was already there, placing his hand on the back of the chair to stop its motion. The instant his fingers touched the wood, the chair stopped. The creaking ceased so abruptly that the silence felt deafening. We could hear our own breathing, ragged and quick in the stuffy room. "Sit in it," I dared him, though every instinct told me this was a terrible idea. Kyle hesitated, then slowly lowered himself into the chair. He gripped the armrests and gave it a tentative rock. Nothing unusual happened. The chair moved exactly as it should, creating that same familiar creaking sound we'd been hearing. "See, it's just an old chair," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I was about to respond when the chair suddenly stopped on its own. Kyle hadn't stopped rocking. The chair simply froze mid-motion. He shot up so fast, he nearly knocked the chair over. "We're leaving," he said, his face pale even in the dim light. We backed out of the room, and Kyle pulled the door shut. This time, he made sure to lock it. We didn't speak about what we'd seen as we stumbled back to the living room. Derek was now fully asleep on the couch, snoring softly. Kyle and I spent the rest of the night taking turns, standing guard by the hallway, listening for any more sounds. Nothing came. When his parents returned the next afternoon, he told them about a broken window latch in the sewing room that needed fixing. His mother went to check it immediately. 20 minutes later, she emerged looking troubled. "The window's fine," she said, but Grandma's rocking chair was facing the wrong direction. It's always faced the window so she could watch the birds while she worked. Kyle and I exchanged glances, but said nothing. To this day, I've never experienced anything I couldn't explain away. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear that rhythmic creaking, that slow, deliberate rocking of a chair that shouldn't be moving. I can see this as a harrowing story about a child being nearly abducted from school. I'll help you rewrite it in English, setting it in a different time and place, while maintaining the tension and first-person narrative. I'll make it slightly longer and include some new details to keep it unpredictable. This happened so long ago that some of the details have gotten fuzzy in my mind. It was the last day of school before summer break in 1976. Back then, 3rd grade was the final year our parents had to pick us up from school. Starting 4th grade, we were old enough to walk home alone. Mom always picked me up on special days like this. Tommy and I had made plans to meet at my house afterward to celebrate the start of summer. He wasn't in my class that year, so we took different hall exits when school let out. When the final bell rang, our teacher, Mrs. Harrison, lined us up and walked us to the front entrance. She waited outside with us until our parents arrived from the parking lot. I kept scanning the crowd of station wagons and pickup trucks, looking for Tommy's dad's blue Chevy Nova to pull up. Suddenly, I heard someone calling my name. Michael. Michael, I looked up to see a man in a brown suit waving as he approached through the crowd of parents. He introduced himself as Tommy's uncle and said he was there to give me a ride. I went to Mrs. Harrison and told her, "They're here to pick me up." "Who came for you, sweetie?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. I pointed to the man, who smiled and waved at her. She nodded and let me go. He led me through the clusters of waiting parents with quick, nervous steps, practically stumbling over his words. With my heavy book bag, I could barely keep up. He explained that Tommy's father was tied up at the auto shop, so he'd volunteered to drive me there. "I told Tom I'd bring you by so you two can start your summer plans," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. It wasn't until I climbed into his maroon Ford sedan that unease crept over me. Where was Tommy? Why wasn't he there too? "Tommy's already at the house," the man said, catching my worried expression in the rearview mirror. "We'll be there in no time." I was shy around adults I didn't know, but something felt off as he drove, talking nonstop. He asked about my favorite subjects, whether I played Little League, and reminisced about his own childhood in Chicago. The drive stretched on for what felt like 20 minutes, unusual in our small Pennsylvania town where everything was close. The walk to school took barely 10 minutes. The unfamiliar streets made my stomach churn. When he finally parked in front of a plain white house with peeling paint, warning bells rang in my head. We went inside. He locked the door behind us with a click that made me jump. The living room was dark, all curtains drawn, with only a dim table lamp casting shadows that danced on the wood-paneled walls. The air smelled stale, like it had been closed up for weeks. "Where's Tommy?" I asked directly, my voice small in the dim space. The man's easy manner shifted. His hands fluttered nervously as he answered, "Oh, he's downstairs playing with his Atari. Just wait here a minute." He disappeared through a door off the kitchen. I heard creaking stairs as he descended to the basement. My heart hammered against my chest. The house felt wrong, all wrong. I ran to the front door and tried the handle. Locked. Panic rose in my throat as I processed what might be happening. Part of me still hoped Tommy would come bounding up those stairs any second. With trembling legs, I hurried to the kitchen and found a rotary phone mounted on the wall. I dialed 0 for the operator. "Please," I whispered when she answered, "send police to this house. A man brought me here, and I don't know where I am. I think something's wrong. Stay on the line, sweetie." "What's the address?" I had no idea. "I don't know, but please hurry." She assured me help was coming as I described what I could: the white house with green shutters, the maroon car out front. I left the receiver dangling behind a kitchen towel and crept back to the living room, positioning myself where he'd left me. His footsteps creaked back up the stairs. "Michael, come down here. Tommy wants to show you something cool." When I didn't answer, he called again. Then the steps quickened. He appeared at the top of the stairs and spotted me frozen in place. "Didn't you hear me calling? Tommy's waiting. Can I go home now?" I managed to whisper, my whole body shaking. His forced smile melted into something darker. He moved toward me with deliberate steps, then suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Come on," he growled. "You're going downstairs." I pulled back and screamed, but his grip was iron strong. "Stop fighting me. If you're a good boy, I'll let you see your mother again." Terror overtook me. I stopped resisting as he dragged me toward the basement door. My sneakers scuffed against the linoleum as I stumbled along, hot tears streaming down my face. The basement was exactly as terrifying as I'd imagined: concrete floor, metal support beam, and a bare bulb casting jaundiced light across the empty space. It looked like something from a Vincent Price movie. My older brother Tommy had snuck me into watching. He pushed me toward the far corner and locked the door behind him. For what felt like forever, I heard him pacing upstairs, back and forth, back and forth. Eventually, he cracked the door open. "Are you hungry?" "No," I lied, terrified he'd go to the kitchen and discover the phone. The door closed again, with a bang that echoed in the concrete space. I sat curled in the corner, hugging my knees, reciting the Lord's Prayer over and over in my head. Then I heard it, the doorbell. 3 sharp rings, followed by heavy pounding on the front door. My heart leaped. The doorbell chimed again, followed by shouts of police. "Open up!" I scrambled to the stairs and pounded on the locked door. "Help! I'm down here. Help me!" A tremendous crash shook the house. Footsteps thundered overhead. Someone yanked open the basement door, and I looked up into the face of a uniformed officer with kind eyes. "It's okay, son. You're safe now." Outside, red and blue lights painted the quiet residential street. 3 patrol cars and neighbors gathered on sidewalks. I told 2 officers everything while we waited for my parents. The man was led away in handcuffs, and I never saw him again. When Mom and Dad arrived, she collapsed, sobbing and clutching me so tight I could barely breathe. Later, I learned the police had already been to the school. Tommy's father, when notified, immediately suspected who might have taken me: a recently fired employee from his shop who'd been acting strange. Apparently, he'd overheard Tommy and me planning to meet after school. I went to a counselor for months afterward. My parents were furious with Mrs. Harrison for not properly verifying the identity of who was picking me up. If I hadn't made that phone call, I know I wouldn't be here today telling this story. The man was sentenced to prison, but I heard through the grapevine that he was paroled after 20 years. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there somewhere. That summer of 1976 changed everything. I never walked home alone again until high school, and I still check my locks twice every night before bed. When people meet me, they often wonder why I've created such elaborate fabrications about my life. Sometimes I tell them the truth, though it's rare anyone believes me. I've finally decided to record everything, so when I'm gone, there will be a record. And next time someone asks, I can simply direct them to this recording. Most people walk past a homeless person without a second glance. Some offer spare change, which is becoming increasingly uncommon as fewer people carry cash. But occasionally, someone shows genuine kindness by buying me food or necessities. Even more rarely, someone stops to talk. Many homeless individuals avoid conversations about their past. We've all experienced trauma of some kind and generally prefer not to discuss it. My story, however, is unusual. I speak fluently in Italian, English, Spanish, Japanese, and Arabic, with a reasonable understanding of Portuguese, Norwegian, and Mandarin. I'm also quite skilled at diplomatic conversations and finding common ground between opposing parties. People who speak with me inevitably ask why I'm not working as a translator or mediator with these abilities. The answer is simple: because those jobs take place indoors. For the past 7 years, I've lived on the streets of a coastal city in Morocco. I survive on charity and occasional outdoor work like fishing or helping local vendors. I have to abandon any job that requires going inside, as you'll soon understand. I grew up in southern Italy, in a small coastal town near Naples. My parents were fairly affluent, and I attended a private academy. Not one you'd recognize, but my education was exceptional. My life was wonderful. I had many friends, excelled in geography, languages, and music, and even won several regional swimming competitions. We took wonderful family vacations to Greece almost every summer. I'm not trying to boast. I simply want to illustrate the stark contrast between my previous life and my current circumstances. I had absolutely no reason to run away from such a privileged existence. Everything changed shortly after my 14th birthday. On a Saturday afternoon in May, I was supposed to meet friends at a beachside cafe. I arrived early, feeling very grown up and sophisticated. When they texted they'd be running late, I decided to order a gelato while waiting. So there I was, sitting alone with my pistachio ice cream, scrolling through Instagram, when an elderly man approached my table. He appeared to be in his 70s or 80s, with weather-beaten skin and silvery hair. He wore simple linen clothing that might have been quite elegant decades ago, but now showed signs of wear and mysterious stains. He sat down across from me without invitation and simply stared. I tried ignoring him at first, but after a minute I looked up and asked rather irritably, "What do you want?" His response was just 5 words: "The water seeks you now." Then he reached across, pressing a smooth blue-green stone into my palm. He stood up and walked away before I could react. I had never seen him before, nor have I seen him since. Naturally, this encounter puzzled me. Perhaps he had confused me with someone else, I reasoned. Strange, but ultimately just an anecdote to share with my friends when they arrived. I was probably more unsettled than I cared to admit. I finished my gelato and decided to use the restroom before my friends arrived. The cafe's bathroom was just past the outdoor pool area. As I walked by, I noticed my reflection in the still, blue water. On impulse, I leaned over to see better. That was the last moment I ever spent in Italy. I plunged headfirst into scorching heat and blinding brightness. At first, I thought I'd somehow fallen into the pool, but there was no water, only dry, burning sand beneath my hands and knees. Stunned, I looked up into a blazing sun in a cloudless sky. It took several seconds to process what had happened. I was on a beach, but not the familiar Mediterranean coastline. This was a vast, empty stretch of golden sand, meeting a turquoise ocean that stretched to the horizon. I didn't panic immediately. Instead, I assessed my situation. I was outdoors in intense heat, wearing my summer clothes, a light dress and sandals, with no idea where shelter might be found. I could figure out the how later. Survival came first. Looking around, the beach seemed to curve in the distance, and I could make out what appeared to be buildings. That meant civilization, so I began walking along the shoreline. After about 20 minutes, I reached what turned out to be a small coastal resort town. Signs in English and unfamiliar script dotted the storefronts. As I approached a beach bar, a tanned young man with sun-bleached hair called out to me in English, asking if I was lost. I must have looked quite disoriented and out of place. Still confused, but relieved he spoke a language I understood. I stared at him, struggling to articulate my bizarre situation when I truthfully didn't understand it myself. He introduced himself as Alberto and asked where my parents were. When I couldn't provide a coherent answer, he offered to help. "You look dehydrated. Let me get you some water, and we can figure things out," he said, leading me toward the bar. I've since learned this was a tourist area near Brisbane, Australia. A relatively safe place, but I was still a young girl alone thousands of kilometers from home, with no explanation for how I'd arrived there. Alberto seemed genuinely concerned rather than threatening, but I remained cautious. He guided me to a seat under a large umbrella and went inside the bar to get water. I gratefully accepted the bottle he brought back and took several long sips before noticing the small decorative pool beside the bar. As I leaned forward to place the bottle on the table, my hand accidentally brushed the water's surface. I fell hard onto the cobblestones of a busy marketplace at midday. Keep in mind, I was only 14 years old. In the span of perhaps 30 minutes, I'd been transported from my hometown in Italy to a beach in Australia, and now to yet another unknown location. So I think my response was perfectly reasonable under the circumstances. I cried. Finding a quiet corner between market stalls, I huddled against a wall and let the tears flow freely. When I finally composed myself, I observed my surroundings. The marketplace buzzed with activity, vendors calling out in Spanish, colorful displays of fruits, vegetables, handcrafts, and textiles. The air carried the scent of spices and cooking food that would normally have been enticing. A middle-aged woman approached, speaking rapidly in Spanish. I understood enough to grasp. She was asking if I was lost or needed help. I responded in my limited Spanish, explaining I was looking for my parents, a lie, but simpler than the truth. She seemed concerned about a foreign girl alone and offered to take me to the police. That's when it dawned on me. I needed to avoid authorities. Without documentation, money, or a believable story, police involvement would lead to complicated questions I couldn't answer. So I did the only sensible thing. I ran. Darting through the crowded market, I knocked over a basket of peppers in my hasty retreat. The woman called after me, but I kept going, turning randomly down narrow streets until I was certain no one followed. I found myself in a quieter residential area, catching my breath in the shadow of a small church. I spent my first night in Mexico, as I later discovered sleeping in a park, hungry and frightened. The following morning, I began the process of adapting to street life. I begged for pesos near a tourist area, using my Italian accent to gain sympathy, and managed to buy some food and a used sweater from a second-hand stall as the evenings were unexpectedly cool. Over the next few months, I learned to survive in Mexico City. I discovered where to find free meals, safe sleeping spots, and how to avoid authorities. I became proficient in Spanish, and even made tentative connections with other street youth. It was during this time I met Juanita, a 17-year-old girl who led a small group of teenage scavengers and petty thieves. She recognized my intelligence and took me under her protection. Under her guidance, I learned the subtle art of pickpocketing tourists, how to spot easy targets, and most importantly, how to disappear into crowds afterward. Juanita's group offered community and relative safety in exchange for contribution to their collective resources. We weren't violent criminals, just desperate kids trying to survive. I never stole from people who seemed like they couldn't afford the loss, targeting only obvious tourists with expensive cameras and designer clothing. After about a year in Mexico City, I had grown more confident and resourceful. I was still small for my age, but quick and observant. The language barrier had long since dissolved, and I could easily pass for a local when necessary. Life wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. That all changed during the festival of light celebrations. The streets were crowded with tourists and locals enjoying the festivities. For Juanita's group, it was the perfect opportunity for what we called a sweep, coordinated pickpocketing of distracted visitors. We had identified a group of American tourists who were clearly enjoying the local tequila and positioned ourselves strategically. I was to bump into a middle-aged man, while Juanita relieved him of his wallet. Our plan proceeded smoothly until the moment of execution. As I moved forward, another group of street kids appeared, eyeing the same mark. Juanita saw the potential conflict and signaled to abort. But one of our newer members, Diego, didn't notice and proceeded anyway. He clumsily bumped the tourist, whose friend immediately spun around and grabbed Diego's wrist. Chaos erupted. The other street group thought we had deliberately interfered with their target and confronted us aggressively. Juanita stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation, when the leader of the rival group shoved her hard. Diego, protective of Juanita, threw a punch, and suddenly a knife appeared. I saw the glint of metal and ran as the fight escalated. Police whistles pierced the festival noise, and everyone scattered. I sprinted down crowded streets, turned into an alley, and found myself facing a dead end with a decorative fountain in the center. Hearing footsteps behind me, I made a split-second decision. Perhaps water was my enemy, but now it might also be my salvation. I leaped into the fountain. I emerged in bitter cold, knee-deep in snow. The transition from the warm Mexican night to what must have been the dead of winter somewhere far north was shockingly abrupt. Heavy snowflakes fell silently around me as I struggled to gain my bearings. Shivering violently in my thin clothing, I trudged forward through the blinding white. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably less than an hour, I spotted lights in the distance. Drawing on my remaining strength, I staggered toward what turned out to be a small farmhouse. I pounded desperately on the door, my fingers numb with cold. A tall, bearded man opened it, exclaiming in a language I didn't understand. Seeing my condition, he quickly pulled me inside toward the blazing fireplace. His wife brought blankets and hot tea, while staring at me with obvious confusion. How had a foreign teenager in summer clothes appeared at their remote farm during a snowstorm? I later learned I was in northern Norway, and the couple who rescued me were Torvald and Ingrid. They spoke little English, and I knew no Norwegian, but we managed basic communication through gestures and the few words we shared. They were childless and lived a simple farming life, primarily raising sheep and growing vegetables during the brief summer months. Perhaps I should have been more cautious about accepting help from strangers, but my alternatives were freezing to death or attempting to navigate an unfamiliar, snowy wilderness. I chose to trust them, and it proved to be one of my better decisions. Over the following months, I learned Norwegian and farm work. I helped tend the sheep, repair fences, and assist with household chores. Torvald and Ingrid never pressed me for details about my past. Seemingly content with the vague story I provided about running away from bad circumstances in Italy. They treated me with kindness and respect, even setting aside a small room for me in their modest home. For the first time since leaving Italy, I felt a sense of stability. I was careful never to go near the creek that ran behind their property, or the small pond where they fished in summer. I even avoided the bathroom when Ingrid was filling the tub. I might have stayed with them indefinitely, growing into adulthood on that peaceful Norwegian farm. But after nearly 2 years, an accident changed everything. It was early spring, and Torvald had gone to the nearest town for supplies. Ingrid and I were repairing a damaged section of the barn roof when she lost her footing. Her fall was terrible. She landed awkwardly on farm equipment below. I rushed to her side and found her leg badly broken, with bone protruding through skin and blood pooling rapidly. The nearest neighbor was kilometers away, and without Torvald's truck, I had no quick way to get help. Ingrid was losing blood quickly, and I needed to act. Our only phone was in the farmhouse kitchen. I knew what using the door might mean, but Ingrid's life was at stake. As I crossed the threshold into the house, I whispered an apology, hoping she would somehow understand when I disappeared. I emerged in a crowded train station at night. Bright fluorescent lights, unfamiliar announcements over loudspeakers, and hundreds of people rushing in all directions overwhelmed my senses. Signs in Japanese surrounded me, and I realized with dismay that I had arrived in yet another country where I couldn't speak the language. I hope Ingrid received the help she needed, though I doubt it was in time. The last I saw of her was her pain-stricken face as I ran toward the house, and then she and the farm vanished in an instant. Once again, I had to start over. Tokyo, as I soon discovered, was vastly different from rural Norway. The population density, technology, and urban complexity presented new challenges. I was 17 now, more mature and experienced in adapting to new environments, but still clearly foreign and without resources. I spent my first few nights in Tokyo sleeping in parks and train stations, learning quickly that Japanese authorities were efficient at identifying and approaching homeless individuals. I needed to become less visible, which was difficult as a Western girl in a predominantly Japanese city. Fortune smiled on me when I met Yukiko, a Japanese girl about my age who had also been living on Tokyo streets. Unlike my previous encounters, Yukiko wasn't part of any organized group. She had fled an abusive home situation and was surviving through a combination of part-time work at food stalls and collecting discarded but still edible food from behind restaurants and convenience stores. Yukiko taught me essential Japanese phrases and cultural norms that helped me blend in better. In exchange, I shared my street survival techniques from Mexico City. We formed a mutually beneficial partnership, looking out for each other and sharing resources. Japan's strict social structure made street life particularly challenging. We kept moving between districts to avoid unwanted attention and developed a system for maintaining a level of cleanliness that allowed us to use public spaces without immediately being identified as homeless. For over a year, Yukiko and I managed to scrape by in Tokyo. We even saved enough money for occasional nights in capsule hotels during the harshest winter weather. I was careful to avoid bathtubs, rain puddles, or any significant body of water. The incident that ended my time in Japan occurred at a public park. Yukiko and I were helping at a community festival, earning a small amount by cleaning up after the event. As the crowd thinned in the evening, a group of intoxicated businessmen began harassing Yukiko. When she politely rejected their advances, one grabbed her arm roughly. I intervened, causing the man to lose his balance. He fell into the park's ornamental pond, pulling me with him as he tried to regain his footing. The moment my body broke the water's surface, Tokyo disappeared. I found myself sprawled on sun-baked tiles beside a tranquil courtyard fountain. The air was hot and dry, filled with unfamiliar spices and the distant sound of a melodic call to prayer. I had arrived in Morocco, as I would soon discover, specifically in the coastal city of Essaouira. At 19, this was my 5th displacement, and by now I understood the rules of my curse. Water was the trigger, not just doors as you might have initially expected from my story. Any substantial body of water that I physically entered, or sometimes merely touched, would transport me to another random location on Earth. Windows, doorways, and other thresholds posed no danger unless they led to water. This realization had been forming gradually through my experiences, but now I was certain. The old man who had given me the blue-green stone all those years ago hadn't been confused. He had recognized something about me. "The water seeks you now," he had said. The stone he gave me was smooth like a river rock, water-worn. I still carried it, my only possession from my previous life. Once I understood the nature of my curse, I could better control my circumstances. Morocco became my home for the next 7 years, and remains so today. The dry climate suits my condition, and I've learned enough Arabic to communicate effectively. I support myself with outdoor jobs, helping fishermen, while carefully avoiding touching the sea, selling trinkets to tourists, and occasionally telling fortunes using skills I developed during my time with Juanita in Mexico. I found relative stability until one evening, when a violent storm caught me unprepared. Seeking shelter, I ducked into what I thought was an abandoned building. Inside, I discovered a deep cistern filled with rainwater. As I backed away from it, I slipped on the wet floor and fell in. The water wasn't my expected portal this time. Instead, I plunged deep, deeper than any cistern could possibly be, until I no longer felt like I was in water at all. I was sinking through darkness, and when I finally landed, it was on solid ground in absolute blackness. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was in an enormous underground cavern. Dim light emanated from bioluminescent fungi growing along the walls, casting an eerie blue-green glow similar to the stone in my pocket. In that faint light, I made out shapes moving in the distance, tall, slender figures that walked upright, but moved with a strange fluidity. I approached cautiously and discovered what appeared to be a settlement. The inhabitants weren't human. They were amphibious creatures standing about 2 meters tall with greenish-gray skin, large black eyes, and webbed hands and feet. They moved with grace on land, but were clearly adapted for water as well, with gill-like structures visible on their necks. Before I could retreat, several of them surrounded me. They didn't speak, but communicated through a series of clicks, whistles, and hand gestures. They weren't aggressive, but firmly guided me toward a large depression in the cavern floor. A pit about 20 meters across containing about 40 humans of various ages and ethnicities. The amphibians pushed me down a slippery ramp into the pit, which I soon discovered I couldn't climb out of. The walls were too smooth and too high, and amphibian guards patrolled the perimeter constantly. A woman approached me, speaking French. "Welcome to the deep," she said, introducing herself as Isabelle from Canada. She explained that the amphibians, whom the captives called the swimmers, used humans for labor and other purposes none of us fully understood. They kept us fed with strange fungi and fish from underground lakes, and made us work for roughly half of each day, but otherwise left us alone. Time was impossible to measure accurately in the perpetual twilight of the cavern, but someone had begun scratching marks on the stone wall to count days. According to this calendar, the first captives had arrived over 34 years earlier. Some had died of age or accidents, while others were taken by the swimmers and never returned. Each day followed the same pattern. We would be divided into groups and led through a maze of tunnels to work sites where we excavated new chambers, cultured fungi gardens, or constructed curious artifacts under the swimmers' direction. They communicated their wishes through drawings and demonstrations, and while they rarely harmed us directly, we all remembered what happened to those who defied them. Paolo, an Italian man about my age, told me of a Brazilian woman who had refused to work. The swimmers had dragged her to one of their underwater lakes and held her beneath the surface until she stopped struggling. They then brought her body back and left it in the pit for 3 days before removing it. A clear message to the rest of us. I settled into this new existence, sharing stories with my fellow captives during our rest periods and working diligently when required. We spoke multiple languages among ourselves, taught each other songs from our homelands, though quietly, as the swimmers reacted aggressively to loud human singing, and maintained our humanity despite the circumstances. Months passed, perhaps years. The scratches on the wall became too numerous to count accurately. New captives occasionally joined us, appearing confused and terrified as I must have. I helped integrate them into our community, explaining the rules and routines that would keep them alive. It was after one such arrival, a young Moroccan man named Amir, that I began to think seriously about escape. Amir had been a civil engineering student before his capture, and possessed knowledge that complemented my years of experience in various survival situations. Together, we began to formulate a plan. First, we needed to understand more about our captors and our prison. Through careful observation during work details, we pieced together that the swimmers were performing some kind of long-term project, perhaps building a city or a temple. They didn't seem malicious so much as utterly indifferent to human suffering, viewing us as we might view livestock or tools. More importantly, we discovered something about the nature of water in this place. The underground lakes weren't just reservoirs, they were portals, similar to what I had experienced on the surface world. We observed the swimmers emerging from and disappearing into these bodies of water, often returning with materials not found in our cavern. Our plan formed slowly, refined in whispered conversations during rest periods. The pit where we were kept had a small seepage of water in one corner, barely a trickle, but enough to form a small puddle. The swimmers never came down into the pit. They used ramps to bring us out when needed and retracted them afterward. We began excavating beneath the puddle, carefully concealing our work. Paolo distracted the guards with elaborate shadow puppetry he had learned as a child, while Amir and I dug, using broken tools we had managed to smuggle back from work sites. Other captives joined our effort, passing the excavated material throughout the group to be gradually disposed of during work details. After months of patient digging, we had created a chamber about 1 meter deep and wide enough for a person to lie in. Water slowly filled it, creating a small pool. We had no guarantee this would work. It might simply be a dead end, or worse, it might alert the swimmers to our activities. But we had to try. The night we decided to attempt our escape, we gathered the 36 remaining captives. I would go first, then Amir, and the others would follow. If the pool was indeed a portal, we had no idea where it might lead, but anywhere seemed better than permanent captivity. I lay down in our crude pool, the cool water soaking through my tattered clothing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt the familiar disorientation, the pulling sensation I had experienced 5 times before. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, I was lying in shallow water on a moonlit beach. I had emerged in Morocco again, not far from Essaouira, where I had entered the underwater realm. Was this coincidence, or had my journey come full circle for a reason? I waited anxiously, hoping to see Amir and the others emerge from the water, but no one came. That was 7 years ago. I've lived in Morocco ever since, carefully avoiding significant contact with water. I sometimes wonder if the others escaped, or if something went wrong after I left. Did the swimmers discover our plan? Are my friends still trapped underground, or did they emerge elsewhere in the world? I still don't understand why the old man cursed me that day in Italy. Was it random cruelty, or did he somehow save me from a worse fate? Perhaps he transferred his own curse to me, finally freeing himself after years or decades of water-triggered displacements. The blue-green stone he gave me remains my only clue, and my only possession from before this journey began. Sometimes I think I see patterns in its smooth surface, like a map of waterways or a script I cannot read. Other times it seems to glow faintly in the darkness, reminiscent of the bioluminescent fungi in the swimmer's cavern. I've considered seeking help, finding someone who might understand ancient curses or water magic. But who would believe such a story? And what if in seeking help, I accidentally lead the swimmers to new hunting grounds? How many of those missing persons statistics, thousands each year who vanish without a trace, are actually prisoners in that underground realm? So I remain here, living in the open air, avoiding even the simplest pleasures like baths and swimming, that others take for granted. Sometimes I see a child splashing in a fountain or teenagers diving into the sea, and I feel a pang of loss for the normal life I might have had. If you're listening to this and have experienced something similar, know that you're not alone. And if you ever meet an old man offering you a water-smooth stone, my advice is simple: run in the opposite direction. As for me, I'll be here, carefully navigating a world where every puddle, pool, and raindrop might be a doorway to somewhere else, or back to the domain of the swimmers who wait below. I sat on my weathered wooden chair, smoking one cigarette after another, as I stared at the constant static hissing from my ancient radio receiver. I am exhausted but unable to rest, and I cannot remember when I last felt safe or at peace in this lighthouse. Boredom consumes me to the point where I hope something, anything, might happen. Yet I remain conflicted knowing what occurs in this cursed station, and all the terror and chaos that follows such events. But even if pure dread courses through my veins, at least I would be feeling something. The noises have stopped for now. The constant wailing and tapping against the stone walls, and the disembodied voices echoing from the spiral staircase. Outside, my quarters have temporarily ceased. These unnatural sounds always leave me on edge, never allowing a moment of true calm. Yet somehow the ominous silence feels even worse, as I hear nothing but the crackling static from the radio, reminding me that I am completely alone. Eventually, I drag myself up from the chair, my old bones protesting as I slowly walk toward the window and look out at the restless ocean beyond. The seascape is haunting, endless churning waters stretching as far as the eye can see, all shrouded in perpetual mist. It's always dusk here. The lighthouse is lit by flickering oil lamps in the corridors and quarters, but the only illumination outside comes from the sickly green orb hanging in the gray sky above. Not the sun or moon, but something else. I cannot recall when I last saw actual sunlight, blue skies, drifting clouds, or any land whatsoever. God, I miss them all. I never knew how fortunate I was in the old world, in countless ways. I don't spend long gazing into the mist, knowing it's dangerous to do so. Several of my fellow keepers have gone mad after staring into the fog for too long, as something in the endless gray consumes them and destroys whatever sliver of hope they have left. Then there are the inhabitants of the outer waters, the creatures that lurk beneath the waves, their hideous silhouettes barely visible beneath the surface, though one can occasionally hear their guttural bellows or banshee-like cries in the distance, carrying across the empty waters. Thankfully, the sea beasts rarely approach our isolated lighthouse, and even if they did, the mysterious light should keep them at bay. The winged terrors from above are a different matter, however. It has never seriously occurred to me to attempt escape from our prison and take my chances on the dark waters. A couple of keepers have tried, managing to lower themselves on ropes or build makeshift rafts from driftwood. But those who made it away from shore always return, their eyes wide with terror as they babble incoherently about monstrosities and horrors beyond all comprehension. These unfortunate souls often barricade themselves inside their small quarters, sealing the door shut and covering all the windows. Years may pass before they emerge again, if they do at all. I continue to ponder such terrors when I am jarred back to reality by the crackling sound coming from my handheld radio, my primary means of communication with our cursed community, the keepers who are my responsibility to supervise and support. When I lift the receiver, a dull, emotionless voice informs me that a delivery of special items has arrived at the dock entrance, and I must go down to sign for and collect these items. I feel relieved to have some purpose, though I dread the chaos that will likely follow the distribution. Nevertheless, this is my job and responsibility. So I take a final drag on my cigarette before descending the winding stone staircase. I open the first door and come face to face with the dead eyes of the boatman, his wrinkled face devoid of expression or compassion. I gave up trying to engage this man in conversation long ago. In fact, I'm not sure the boatman is even human. Perhaps he's nothing more than a supernatural vessel designed for this sole purpose. Behind the unblinking boatman is the second door, sealed tightly shut. I've never seen what lies beyond the outer door, and have no desire to do so. Instead, my focus is on the bulky crates and containers I'll take ownership of and deliver, using my trusty handcart and the creaking old dumbwaiter. I avoid the boatman's lifeless eyes as I scrawl my signature on a sheet and begin shifting the containers into the entryway. I have no idea what purpose my signing serves, and can only assume it's some meaningless bureaucratic ritual designed to further drain my morale. Nevertheless, I quickly transfer everything inside and shut the door on the specter-like boatman, sighing with relief as I hear him depart through the second door, returning to whatever nightmarish realm lies beyond. The items take me some time to deliver, as I bring the different-sized containers up one by one, using the dumbwaiter, or carrying them myself up the spiral staircase. Professor Langley's item is always the largest, a heavy sealed trunk filled with God knows what. The professor will empty the trunk and leave it outside his door for me to collect while he does whatever he does with its contents. The other boxes vary in size and weight. I don't know what's inside most of them, and once again, I'm happy to remain ignorant. I traverse the circular walkways on each floor, glancing down at the empty central shaft below, and up at the misty sky visible through the glass dome above. Carefully, I leave the boxes on each doorstep, but I do not knock or attempt to interact with the residents inside. I would be quite happy to avoid my fellow keepers for as long as possible, though I know this is unlikely. As always, I feel conflicted. I dread interactions with the damaged souls who inhabit this hellish lighthouse, yet simultaneously yearn for any form of human contact. Nevertheless, I avoid the others as I finish my deliveries, then return to my own dark and decrepit quarters alone, sweat pouring from my skin. There are no seasons in this realm that I can tell, but the temperature is always either uncomfortably humid or bitterly cold. I can only assume these climate shifts are at the whim of whatever sadistic entity designed this hellish world. I drop my own special item on the side table, a fresh pouch of tobacco that will allow me to continue my filthy habit. My wife Eliza was always urging me to quit, but in this place, chain smoking is the only stress relief I have. Besides, it's far too late to start worrying about lung cancer. I go straight to my small washroom, splashing cold water on my face and enjoying some small relief. But then I glance up and see the green patch growing on my bathroom ceiling, watching the slow drip of viscous liquid falling into my basin. I know what it is in an instant: ectoplasm. I suppose the natural reaction to seeing ectoplasm leaking through one's ceiling should be terror. But what I feel in that moment is angry frustration. I storm back out of my washroom and grab my radio from the side table, my hands still shaking with fury as I set the frequency and make the call. Professor Langley, I state firmly down the line, barely suppressing the anger in my voice. There is a lengthy pause before I receive a response, as a surprisingly meek voice breaks through the static. Yes. Can I help, Professor? I need you to come down here immediately, I order. Oh, I see, the professor answers. Okay then, I'll see you shortly. 2 minutes later, Professor Langley is standing in my washroom, glancing up at the ectoplasmic stain on my ceiling with a look of mild embarrassment etched across his thin, pasty face. Professor Langley technically wasn't a fully qualified academic. Although I understand, he did attend a couple of years of university where he picked up some scientific knowledge. He used what he learned to indulge his disturbing interests until the authorities caught up with him, and he ended up here. But as they say, a leopard cannot change its spots, and this is the cause of our current predicament. Langley isn't much to look at, being a slight figure with pale skin and a thinning hairline. He speaks in a soft and apologetic tone and seems very unassuming at first glance. But of course, there is a dark side to the man that makes him very dangerous. Nevertheless, the professor knows why he's here and so is immediately defensive. Oh dear, I must apologize for this mess. All very unfortunate, I'm afraid. I let my enthusiasm get the better of me. Such is the passion for my work. He smiles thinly as he glances across at me with his calculating eyes. I avoid his gaze, feeling a cold chill running through me as my discomfort lessens my anger. Professor, we agreed that if you were to continue your experiments, you would make sure to keep the ectoplasmic residue and the disturbances under control. This isn't the first incident. I have received other complaints. There is annoyance in his voice as he answers, "Well, perhaps you can bill me for the damage." It was a facetious question, of course. He knows very well I have no power over him, except for one thing. Professor Langley, I say firmly, you know very well that your special deliveries come from the overseer, and if he were made aware of these incidents, he may reconsider this arrangement. Now, you wouldn't want that, would you, Professor? I make eye contact with him after delivering my thinly veiled threat. I instantly regret doing so, however, as he shoots me a murderous glare, and I can imagine what's going through his mind at that moment, as he surely fantasizes about dissecting me piece by piece inside his laboratory. But the professor is smart enough to know this isn't possible. After a tension-filled pause, his eyes soften as he speaks in a more conciliatory tone. I apologize profusely, Mr. Morgan. This will not happen again. I don't believe him. We've had this conversation before and no doubt will again. But right then, I want him out of my quarters, so I accept his false assurances. I go on to clean the stain on my washroom ceiling as a temporary fix before I sit back down in my chair and wait. Although for what, I cannot say. I don't know how long it is before I receive the next call through my radio. A noise complaint about number 7. That would be Mrs. Reynolds' quarters on the level below mine. I groan aloud, dreading the house call that will follow, but knowing it is necessary. Soon after, I find myself in the widow Reynolds' front room, sipping tea from the woman's finest china as I scan the neatly decorated and immaculately maintained surroundings. Quirky little ornaments rest upon carefully dusted shelves, alongside lovingly framed family photographs, reminders of better times. Mrs. Reynolds herself sits in the chair opposite me, smiling politely as she offers me a biscuit from a neatly stacked pile on a matching plate. She's a frail woman with kind eyes and a sweet smile, but the wrinkles on her face tell a story, as does the immeasurable sadness behind her gaze. Life has not been kind to the widow Reynolds, and she has paid dearly for her mistakes. The cozy living room seems warm and welcoming to the casual observer, but there are subtle signs that something isn't right. Upon closer inspection, the family portraits are disturbing. There is Mrs. Reynolds, her late husband, and 3 children, except the face of the middle child has been scratched out on each, and every photograph replaced by an ominous dark circle. This was Tommy, the black sheep of the family, and the only child still with his mother. The hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I think of the padlocked bedroom just yards from where I sit, and I hope the door is secure enough to contain the monster within. I smile faintly after taking a sip of sweet tea and clear my throat before bringing up the difficult issue. Mrs. Reynolds, I thank you for your hospitality as always, but I'm afraid this isn't a social call. I see, the widow answers, her smile disappearing as her face suddenly drops. As if on cue, Tommy begins one of his furious tantrums, slamming his fists against the door and walls and screaming like a banshee. The terrible din makes my head pound as Mrs. Reynolds shouts out, "Tommy, we have a visitor. Behave yourself, damn you, hear me." I hear the anger and frustration in her voice and recognize a woman on the edge. Tommy takes little notice of his mother's shouted words, continuing to scream and bang with all the fury of hell until he eventually tires himself out. With peace temporarily restored, Mrs. Reynolds looks up at me with tears in her eyes. I know they're a problem, Tommy's outbursts, but you need to know that I'm doing my best. It's not fair on him being locked up in that room all the time. I shake my head while interjecting, "You know we can't let him out, not after what happened last time." My body shudders as the horrifying memories come flooding back. Mrs. Reynolds surely shares my trauma, as all the color suddenly drains from her face. "Oh no," she exclaims defensively. "I'm not suggesting that at all. But surely we can make some alterations to make him more comfortable. And that medicine they send for him, I keep saying the dosage is too low. Can you speak with the overseer, sir? You can make him listen, I know you can." She is pleading with me, begging for my help. I feel terrible because there is nothing I can do. The overseer would never agree to her requests, and there is no point even asking. Still, I cannot bear to say no to the widow Reynolds, not after everything she's gone through. "Okay, I'll talk to him," I finally reply. "Thank you, sir. You're a good man." Suddenly, I cannot bear to stay in that room because I know she is wrong. I am not a good man. Far from it. I make my excuses, setting down my mug and heading for the door. But to my surprise, Mrs. Reynolds jumps up from her chair, placing a firm hand on my arm as she stops me from leaving. I turn to face the woman, seeing her eyes now filled with an uncharacteristic intensity. She speaks to me like she's never done before, as raw emotion seeps through her words. They say he's a monster, and I know he's done terrible things. God, I know that better than anyone. But he's my son, my baby boy. I can't turn my back on him, not ever. Tommy's all I've got left, and I've got to protect him. You understand, don't you, mister? Morgan, I feel tears welling up in my eyes, her words striking me like a fist to the stomach. I break free from her grasp, muttering something incoherent before darting to the front door. As I run out, I hear Tommy begin yet another furious tantrum, screaming and banging as his mother pleads for him to stop. I cannot deal with this, however, instead fleeing like a coward as I retreat to the relative sanctuary of my own quarters. I dwell on the encounter with the widow Reynolds for some time after, her words repeating in my head as I experience intense feelings of pain and guilt. Does she know what I had done? Is she privy to the terrible secret I carry in my broken heart? I suppose none of us are innocent in this place. My train of thought is suddenly interrupted by a commotion outside my door, as something big and fast tears past my quarters. I instinctively jump up, sensing danger as I grab my harpoon gun from its cabinet and fill my pockets with spare bolts. A moment later, I am out on the circular walkway, my weapon in hand as I search for the threat in the dim lamplight. I see a figure below, who I initially don't recognize in the gloom. But then the figure calls out from the central shaft, and I recognize his voice. "Don't shoot, sir. It's only me, I'm afraid." Kraken got loose again. I roll my eyes in frustration before replying. "God damn it, Captain Hayes," I exclaim, shouting down at my downstairs neighbor. "I thought I told you to keep that beast under control." "I know, I'm sorry," Hayes replies. "He's a good pet, really. Just a bit boisterous." I could have laughed at Captain Hayes' flippant statement. Calling Kraken a bit boisterous was like saying Jack the Ripper was a bit naughty. But it is my responsibility to help bring the creature to heel before it does someone serious harm. "Where is he?" I demand impatiently. "Last time I saw him, he was headed for the cellar." "Fantastic," I reply sarcastically, shouldering my harpoon gun and returning to my quarters to retrieve my lamp before I descend in the dumbwaiter to join Captain Hayes and begin our search. I slowly make my way through the darkened cellar, lamp in hand, as I survey the scene of damage and devastation, observing the shelves and boxes that have been knocked over during Kraken's wild rampage. I turn back to Captain Hayes, raising the lamp to illuminate his face, and taking some satisfaction as his old eyes blink from exposure to the light. "We best split up to cover more ground," I say, instantly realizing what a bad idea that is. "Don't be shooting that harpoon at my boy," Captain Hayes cries out. I scoff before turning away. Frankly, I doubt my weapon would do the beast much harm, even in the unlikely case I could get a shot off. I follow the trail of destruction, my heart beating fast in my chest, and my breathing becoming labored as I nervously scan the path in front of me, the lamp shaking in my hand. I freeze when I hear the low, guttural growl coming out of the darkness. Instinctively, I back off, only to trip over a discarded box, falling heavily and dropping my gun and lamp. The beast recognizes my weakened state and charges. its huge form propelling across the dark void. I feel the immense weight hitting my chest, forcing me back down on the floor. Sharp tentacles wrap around my ribcage, making me scream out in pain and shock. I hear its beak snapping just inches from my face, and I close my eyes, preparing for the worst. But suddenly, there is a high-pitched whistle, and the beast looks up, releasing me from its death grip and slithering across the cellar floor. I warily look up in time to see the silhouette of Captain Hayes, standing in front of the cellar door, with the dim, artificial light from the stairwell behind him. The octopus-like form of Kraken glides up to meet his master, its aggressive nature now transformed into friendly obedience as its owner rewards it with a treat. I gather myself, retrieving my lamp and gun before shouting angrily at my neighbor, "Damn it, Hayes. That monster almost crushed me to death. How many times must I tell you to keep it in a tank?" "Yes, yes," Captain Hayes replies as he strokes his pet's head. "This will be the last time, I promise." I roll my eyes in frustration, knowing he is full of lies, but realizing there isn't a thing I can do about it. I return to my quarters and examine my bruised ribs in the washroom mirror. Unsurprisingly, my shirt is torn to shreds, but the injuries have already started healing. This is always the way in this place, though sometimes I wish I would receive a fatal wound that would end my misery once and for all. But I know there is no chance of this happening. The overseer wouldn't let me off the hook so easily. I clean myself up and go back to my chair, sitting silently and awaiting the next inevitable emergency. I don't know how long it is until I receive the next call, an ominous burst of static that comes through my radio. I reach out instinctively, knowing it will be something bad. "Hello," I begin. "It's back." My stomach churns upon hearing those words. The caller hasn't introduced himself, but I recognize his voice, Lieutenant Parker, one of my less troublesome neighbors, if I'm honest. Mostly he keeps to himself, but Parker has the misfortune of living on the top floor, which puts him on the front line, so to speak. His call for help and request for me to bring my weapon can only mean one thing: we have a fight on our hands. I reach the top floor and find Lieutenant Parker crouched down in the shadows by the stairwell, his trusty crossbow in hand as he looks upward with intensity in his dark eyes. He doesn't turn in my direction as I stealthily approach, remaining low and staying as quiet as possible as I join him, ducking down beside my neighbor as we hide in the shadows. I know from past experience that Parker doesn't scare easily, but when I get up close, I see the sweat pouring from his brow, his knuckles white as he clutches too tight a hold on his weapon. He nods upward, drawing my attention to the scene above our heads. To my horror, I see the dark shape of the beast which has landed on top of the glass dome, our thin protection against the terrors that rule the misty skies of this realm. This creature is one such terror, largely the size and shape of a human being, but with a vast pair of wings that allow it to soar like a bird of prey, and with claws and teeth which could easily rip a body to shreds. The bat-like monster is busily working on the thin glass, diligently pecking and scratching with its beak and claws in an attempt to break its way through. The winged monster is making steady progress, and it won't be long before it forces its way inside. This is something we cannot allow to happen. I try to control my shaking body as I whisper in my companion's ear, deferring to Lieutenant Parker's superior knowledge in this field. How do you want to handle this? We've got to outflank it. You cover me, and I'll move along the walkway and hit it from behind. I nod my head, not feeling entirely confident about my neighbor's plan, but knowing I cannot offer a better alternative. I watch Parker move, keeping low and in the shadows while barely making a sound. I look back up at the flying creature, my hands still shaking as I grab 2 bolts from my pocket and carefully load them into my harpoon gun. But the metallic clicking sound alerts the beast to my presence. Suddenly, it stops what it's doing and glares down at me with burning red eyes, snarling as it exposes its fangs in a hideous display. A terrifying pause ensues as I find myself transfixed, unable to avert my eyes from the beast's demonic gaze. But then all hell breaks loose as the beast roars with fury, redoubling its efforts as it cracks the glass dome, determined to get at me and devour my still warm flesh. Acting on pure fear and adrenaline, I raise my gun and fire. The bolt hits the winged beast, causing pain and irritation, but no serious injury. I desperately plunge my hand back into my pocket to retrieve fresh ammunition. But the creature has almost broken through, ready to descend and rip me to shreds. But suddenly, I see movement in the corner of my eye, spotting a dark figure emerging from the shadows, and then a projectile flying through the air at speed. A bolt strikes the winged beast in its left wing, and I take a perverse pleasure as it shrieks in pain, unfurling its wings and ascending in a blind panic, flying back into the misty skies above, defeated and humiliated. I breathe a sigh of immense relief as I watch the creature disappear before Lieutenant Parker comes back to my side, the now unloaded crossbow still in his hands. My neighbor looks up at the crack in the glass dome and shakes his head. More will come. That will need to be fixed. I nod, shaking myself back to reality as I deal with the shock of the last few moments. Yeah, I reply solemnly. I'll get my tools and start work on the repair straight away. Okay, Parker answers coolly, before walking down the dimly lit walkway and back toward his quarters, leaving me alone to my work. It is quiet for a time after the winged creature's attack, and I don't know how long that will last. I need some relief after all I've seen and suffered, and so I decide to continue with my secret project, remembering the brief glimpse I'd previously enjoyed, which had kept a glimmer of hope alive in my otherwise blackened heart. After finishing yet another cigarette, I reach for the dial on my radio set, my hand once again shaking, but this time with excitement and anticipation rather than cold terror. I twist the dial to tune the device and search for the frequency I yearn for, ignoring the sinister, otherworldly noises and distorted voices that emanate through the speakers. Finally, I hear the voice I've been searching for, finely tuning to sharpen the sound. My heart almost jumps out of my chest when I hear her voice, my Eliza, as beautiful as she was the day I married her all those years ago. But no, she isn't the same, not anymore. Her voice, once filled with passion, joy, and love, now sounds hollow and grief-stricken. And there is something worse as I realize her heart is filled with a righteous fury. Eliza, I whimper, my emotions getting the better of me. Is that really you? Her reply is sharp and brutal as she snarls through the radio static. What the hell do you want, you bastard? I am taken aback, struggling to find my words to respond. I want to apologize, to tell you how sorry I am. She laughs aloud in open mockery. You're sorry. So what? It makes no difference. You know it's too late for apologies. Look, I desperately interject. I know what I did was terrible, and you've got every right to be angry, Eliza. But you've got to believe I've changed. I don't expect you to forgive me, but let me see my girls at least. Please, you owe me that much. She scoffs, disgusted by my heartfelt plea, losing control as she launches into a furious tirade. You will never see our children again. What happened to the girls was your fault. We don't want you in our world. Don't need you. You can rot in hell for all eternity for all I care. My jaw drops, and my whole body trembles uncontrollably as I look into the radio dial and feel all my resolve collapsing. And then suddenly, my wife's voice disappears from the speaker, replaced by sounds that bring back buried memories of immense grief and guilt. I hear a funeral procession, with the solemn beat of a drum and mournful bagpipes playing as mourners gather around 3 coffins, watching solemnly as they are lowered into the waiting graves one by one. The first coffin is full-sized. The other 2 are notably smaller, designed for children. The tears are rolling down my cheeks in an unstoppable stream as I reach out to touch the cold radio dial. But as I do so, the sounds change again. A voice is barely audible through the static, but it isn't my wife's voice this time. Instead, it's a hideous death rattle, an inhuman creature with a gurgling, choking sound. It opens what must be its mouth to release a high-pitched scream that forces me to retreat from the radio, recoiling as I cover my ears in a futile attempt to drown out the awful din. Mercifully, the hellish wailing does not last as the radio set shuts itself off and leaves me alone in my silent room, shaken and terrified by what I've witnessed. I know I've screwed up badly, and there will be consequences. I just don't expect it to happen so soon. I jump with fright when I hear the ringing, fearfully looking across to the dust-covered red telephone affixed to my living room wall. This phone cannot be used for outgoing calls, and when it rings, it means only one thing: the overseer wants to speak with me. I slowly walk across the wooden floor and reach out to pick up the receiver, holding it up to my ear as I speak meekly. Hello, I expect the familiar voice on the other end to angrily berate me, but instead, his tone is surprisingly sympathetic. What's going on, buddy? He inquires calmly. I feel immense shame and struggle to find the words to justify my actions. I messed up, I know I did. I just thought if I could talk to her, I could make her understand. It's not permitted. You know this. You're not doing anyone any favors by trying to make contact. I shake my head, trying to keep my emotions in check. But I'm sorry, so sorry for the mistakes I made. My remorse is genuine. Can't you see that? Oh, I see it, the overseer replies impatiently, but it's not enough. You committed a grave sin, and this is your assigned punishment. That's just the way it is. I whimper, sobbing as I speak my next words. How long? How long must I stay in this place? For as long as we say, comes the overseer's uncompromising reply. You'll stay and do your job until such time as we consider your punishment complete. Now I suggest you be a good keeper and quit complaining. Follow the rules, my friend, and remember, there are always worse places we can send you. Understood? An ice-cold chill runs through me as I consider his sinister words and imagine the grotesque hellscapes which lie beyond our strange little lighthouse. I understand, I mutter meekly as my last resolve melts away. Good, the overseer responds before promptly hanging up the phone, leaving me to listen to the ominous dial tone. And so this is my story, or at least as much of it as I wish to share with you. I remain trapped here, keeper of a bizarre lighthouse on the edge of a desolate seascape. I can't say exactly where I am, but I know why I'm here, and I realize I deserve my punishment. Time is difficult to gauge in this realm. Honestly, I don't know whether the incidents I have described in this account occurred over a day, a week, a month, or even a year. It makes no difference, I suppose. This is my existence, my sentence, and I shall continue to carry out my duties as keeper, doing what little good I can in the hope that one day I will find redemption. Now, if you'll excuse me, my radio is buzzing. I must go to work. It was 2 in the morning on August 23rd, 2012, when I found myself standing outside the site of the 7th murder in just under a month. My partner Marcus Ramirez and I had been the first responders to this particular incident. The first two to survey the carnage before the forensics team and cleanup crew made it to the scene. We had followed a winding trail of scattered belongings, debris, and blood up to the master bedroom, where we found the mutilated body of the occupant, torn apart and surrounded by blood-stained feathers from a burst pillow. Her name was Alina Thompson. She was an 82-year-old woman who, according to her neighbors, lived alone and rarely received visitors. There was no reason for anyone to have so much as trampled through her garden, let alone kill her. Yet here we were. We had ruled out the idea of it being an animal attack after the first victim's autopsy. A local farmer whom we found dismembered in his ransacked kitchen. Initially, we had attributed it to a bear or even a particularly aggressive mountain lion. But that was before a nervous forensic pathologist from the regional hospital called in to Sheriff Garland's office to solemnly report that the bite marks found on the farmer's body were thoroughly perplexing. According to her, the corpse was covered with human bite marks, and more disturbingly, bite marks that were deemed unidentifiable. We had all hoped that the following incidents, when they happened, wouldn't turn out the same way, that they were animal attacks, or that the autopsy would yield different results. Of course, even by this 7th murder, some officers who were on the scene were still throwing around the idea that these were all just the work of one very aggressive bear. But I knew better, and so did Marcus. I had been standing outside the house, taking long, frequent drags on a cigarette, and listening to the nervous chatter of the other officers as the faulty streetlight above me flickered in and out, battling against the darkness. The detective assigned to the case, Gabriella Morno, emerged in the doorway and began to walk toward me, her face pale even in the hazy orange glow of the streetlight. Officer Kowalski, call me Daniel, I said, extending my hand to shake hers. You're Detective Morno, right? Yeah, that's me. It's my understanding that you were one of the first responders. That's right, I said, my words muffled by the smoke that escaped my mouth in a ghostly wisp. I get that these incidents are uncommon around these parts, to say the least. But I need you to tell me if you or Officer Ramirez noticed any details that stood out from the other crime scenes. I forced my mind to delve back into the last hour and a half. Marcus and I had entered the house at around 2:15 a.m., firstly noticing an upturned bookshelf and broken photo frames strewn at the bottom of the staircase. Upon reaching the landing, we found yet more ravaged furniture and shattered glass. And more than that, a thick crimson trail of blood that led into the master bedroom. My mind drew a blank. It was gruesome, but nothing that really stands out from the oath: the handprints. There were handprints on the ceiling. What? Morno nearly choked. There were bloody handprints on the walls and on the floor. But there were some on the ceiling too. You sure they were handprints? Morno stammered. Sure as I am that we're having this conversation right now. Bloody handprints. Pronounced too. Wasn't like the killer threw the victim up there, or anything like that. You can go and check for yourself. How did? Damn, Morno jogged back to the house and disappeared up the stairs. I looked over at Marcus, who had been sitting on the hood of the car and staring into space ever since the forensics team had arrived. The case was weighing on him, I could tell. With each passing incident, he grew quieter, more withdrawn. His mind was on something, though. The handprints on the ceiling had thoroughly frightened and confused the hell out of me. All of the murders up until this point had been grisly, but none had really possessed any anomalous details aside from the lack of fingerprints and the bizarre teeth marks, both of which we were all becoming desensitized to by now. I was about to attempt to make conversation with Marcus when Morno rushed back out of the house. She looked even more somber than she had before, almost sickly. You were right about the handprints. We're gonna take samples and see if we can identify the perpetrator from that. She almost sounded choked up. Right, I didn't have much hope for that. No attempts at DNA fingerprinting or blood sampling had progressed the case at all in the last 3 weeks. The forensics team are saying that the corpse is covered in bite marks. Human, probably. We'll have to wait for the autopsy. Could still turn out different, we don't know yet. We knew all too well. Morno spoke with the same vain expectation that the other local officers did, and it was becoming apparent that there was no way to downplay this as something less serious than it was. There was a person out there doing this, someone who was savagely butchering people, seemingly without reason. These were serial killings, yet the words serial killer had yet to be used by our sheriff or even Detective Morno. You and Ramirez can head home, Morno said, defeat lurking beneath her gruff, authoritative tone. It's been a long night, and the forensics team will be here for a while. I wished Morno good luck in the hunt for any further evidence and motioned to Marcus to get in the car. I looked back at the house as I turned the vehicle at the end of the street, knowing that soon the dawn would pull the dark shroud from the street, and the townspeople would awaken to yet more unanswered questions. A week later, my exhausted brain was jump-started one slow morning by a phone call while I was at my desk. I didn't recognize the number. Daniel Kowalski. Who am I speaking to? Hi, Mr. Kowalski. This is Vanessa Pierce from the Oregon Daily. I was wondering if you had any additional information on the ongoing investigation into the string of murders in Verbakivka. Her words were a shot of adrenaline that went straight to my head. Or perhaps any clarifying comments on today's story that could make it to a later publication. How the hell do you know about this? How did you get this number? I barked sternly. 3 days ago, we received detailed information about a series of killings in Verbakivka. Do you read the newspaper at all, sir? As if on cue, the most recent copy of the Oregon Daily was slammed down in front of me by the exasperated Sheriff Garland. The bold headline perched arrogantly atop the cheap, fragile paper. Terror in Verbakivka, the forest devourer murders. I looked up at Garland's scowl and then spoke into the phone. Excuse me for 1 minute. I ended the call immediately and set the phone down. I perused the article with growing disgust, already put off by the tasteless reference to the local legend in the headline. In the early hours of August 23rd, Clackamas County Police were called to the scene of a suspected home invasion, only to be met with a grisly discovery: the mutilated, partially eaten body of Eleanor Thompson, 82. This is said to be the 7th in a string of similar horrific incidents that the authorities have been keeping quiet, as not to frighten the citizens of Verbakivka. Looking further down the page, I saw my last name appear, as well as Marcus's. I looked up at Sheriff Garland in shock. "What the hell is all this?" I exclaimed. Garland's steely gaze persisted. "I was hoping you'd know," he said dryly. My mind raced. I never told the press a damn thing. I know that this is the kind of stuff that they love to sink their teeth into, especially around here where nothing happens, and a thought popped into my head. Marcus. He had left his gun and badge on Garland's desk the day after the 7th killing, and no one had been able to contact him since then. I couldn't think of anyone else who would have tipped off the press about this whole ordeal, because no one else at the scene, no matter how harrowed, had been quite as out of their minds as Marcus was. It seemed like the ever-irate sheriff had read my mind. "You think this was Ramirez? Looks that way." The only other person who would have been liable to let any information escape the scene was the lady who called it in. And we made a point not to give her all the details after finding out about the bite marks. We spared those details from past witnesses, too. Well, no one in this precinct has heard from him since last week's incident, and no one has been able to contact him. "Is he married, Kowalski?" the sheriff asked. "No kids." "Girlfriend? He lives alone, Sheriff," I said, my voice descending into an unimpressed monotone. Yeah, Marcus had just up and left. His personality had been melting away ever since the case was opened. It wasn't like him at all. But Garland was, and had always been, an uptight, neglectful son of a bitch. In the 5 years that I'd worked here, he'd never once made a real effort to get to know me or any of the other officers for that matter, despite the fact that he had very little else to do. Perhaps he had a chip on his shoulder because he was laid off from a prestigious position in Portland or something. But it's not like his dismissive, cold self would ever tell me that story. I knew what was about to come out of his mouth. "Well, Kowalski, you know the idiot better than anyone else here, so it falls on you to pull him out of wherever he's holed up and talk to him." "With all due respect, Sheriff," I said, almost gagging on my words, "what would I even say to him?" "The papers have already printed." Garland cut me off. "You tell him whatever you gotta tell him. Have him head down to the Oregon Daily and tell them that forensics screwed up and that it was an animal attack. I can't have these bastards making us look like we aren't handling this, so they're gonna pull that goddamn headline right now." This is a quiet town, and I don't want those bureau boys down here. Cannibalism. Jesus Christ. Garland was perhaps the only human being in the world who still used the term bureau boys to describe the FBI after the 90s. There was a joke about his confidently spoken outdated lingo among the officers, unbeknownst to him. I shot up from my desk, unwilling to tolerate the unanswered what-ifs of the situation. Sheriff, what if they don't pull the headline? What happens then? What if they don't retract their statements? Garland, ever angry, stared at me with an expression that suggested that he was about to blow his top again. He shook his head as his mind attempted to come up with some kind of solution. Right, we interview every single man. No, every single person above the age of 16 in Verbikivka. We get officers out there going door to door, demanding mandatory questioning for every man or woman, boy and girl, above 16 years. They can tell anyone who refuses that they will be immediately put down as a suspect. I cannot have the local people think we aren't handling this. It was all to do with how we appeared, not what we were actually doing. Sure, it mattered that the people of Verbikivka felt like we were confident and assured in the way we dealt with things. But the fact of the matter was, we weren't handling it at all. We were taking blind swings at an invisible assailant who had us all scared to death. Sheriff, I began. Go find Ramirez, he grumbled. I pondered arguing for a second, and then decided that there was no way I was winning this fight. All right, I tried contacting Marcus earlier in the week to no avail, so I knew that my only real option was to head to his place. That is, if he hadn't packed all of his belongings together and jumped on the next plane to the East Coast. As Garland sauntered back to his office, I hurriedly tidied the small mess of papers on my desk and headed out to the lot, opting to take my own car instead of one of the precinct's vehicles. I felt a weight upon my shoulders, as though the thick, humid air was pressing down on me. Marcus's sudden absence was simply another rung on this ladder of stress. I was already thinking nonstop about what I had seen, and when I'd once again find myself staring at another grisly picture just like it. The rain clouds began to spit as I drove through the downtown area. Their dark gray forms harbingers of an oncoming thunderstorm. Marcus lived in an apartment complex about 4 miles away from the station, fairly close to the edge of town, and far enough away from the center for very few cares to be given about any renovations that it may have needed. I had only ever been there once to drop Marcus off when his car was in for repairs, but it wasn't hard to find. The rain hammered down aggressively on the exterior of my car, the relentless metallic banging making me feel as though I was trapped inside a tin can at a shooting range. I pulled into the parking lot and grabbed a raincoat that had slipped from the seat to the foothold in the back of the car, thinking of what exactly I would say to Marcus. That was, of course, if he hadn't locked himself in his bathroom and, well, you know, that wasn't an idea that I was particularly fond of entertaining. I exited my car and walked briskly to the door of the apartment, dialing his room number into the panel by the door and hitting call as the rain hungrily lapped at my shoes. Marcus, it's Daniel. If you're in there, open up. I'm not here to drag you back to Garland. Just here to talk. Nothing came through the receiver. Looking across the lot, I saw Marcus's car parked in the looming shadow of a tall fir tree. I tried calling again, this time trying to sound noticeably irritated. I know you're in there, man. It's been a shitty week for everyone who's on that case, but I've gotta talk to you. Besides, it's coming down out here, and I'm cold as hell. Open the damn door. The receiver crackled suddenly, and a hoarse voice spilled from the speaker. Daniel. God, Yeah, come on up. I pulled the door open and wasted no time in bothering myself with the elevator. I dashed up the stairs to the second floor and marched down the corridor to his room. The door was open slightly, the deadbolt resting on the frame. I had barely even rapped on the door twice before Marcus pulled it open, his eyes wide and a revolver in his right hand. For Christ's sake! I flinched and almost fell backwards at the sight of the weapon's barrel staring me in the face. Marcus lowered it and spoke through deep breaths and an apparent lump in his throat. I had to make sure it was you, Dan. You heard me on whatever, I said, perplexed by Marcus's evidently rampant paranoia, but unwilling to make him feel any more uncomfortable than he already was. It's me, man. It's me. What the hell is this all about? I asked, gesturing at the weapon. You better come in, he said. I followed Marcus into his dimly lit apartment. I had expected it to be far messier than it actually was. There were no takeout boxes littering the floor or sloppily stacked up on top of one another, and no offensive smells emanated from the kitchen. Marcus had clearly been drinking, however. On his coffee table sat a quarter-full bottle of tequila, next to a cheap-looking shot glass. How long you been working on that? I said with a spiritless chuckle. Couple days, I guess. Strong stuff. You want any? His words swayed like a tree in the breeze. I'm good. Marcus, I'm gonna be frank with you. I came here from the station. I saw the newspaper, and Garland needs you to get in touch with the Oregon Daily and tell them to pull that head. Forget Garland. Those were not words spoken by the liquid courage in his blood. They were assured, steady, and serious. Screw Garland and his callous bullshit. He's handled this about as well as a blind shrew in a knife fight. I wouldn't even dream of bringing what I found out to him, because he'd have me in jail before I'd even got the whole story out. And believe you me, Dan, I found some stuff out. I found some goddamn stuff out. What did you find out? I asked, bewildered. You're gonna think I'm just a drunk fool who snapped at the sight of many spilled internal organs. But you're my closest damn friend here, and I trust you're gonna listen to me. I'm listening, I said. Firstly, yeah, I did give the Daily that information, and there is no way in hell I'm having them pull the story. No one is safe here, and they need to know what's going on so they can take as many precautions as they can. The killer has no connections to any of the victims. Anyone could be the next casualty. Hold on. You think you know who the killer is? He gave me a steely, sincere look. My blood ran cold as disbelief flooded my veins. Marcus was completely serious. Somewhere inside my head, logic and fantasy were locked in a fierce duel, and fantasy was winning. Marcus, I said through nervous breaths, do you know who the killer is? If you do, how the hell did you find out? I'm not a detective, Dan. Honestly, I'm barely a police officer. But I think I might actually have some idea. Go on. Marcus poured himself another shallow glass of tequila. I used to frequent a bar downtown, the Broken Antler, you know it. There was a retired old forest ranger who would always be there on Thursday nights. And he had a collection of stories from his time, and we'd all sit around and listen to him. One night, I want to say about 4 months ago, he told a story that he said was his last call before he retired. It happened last year. Went like this. A hiking party of about 7 people got stranded in the deep woods in Eagle Creek Wilderness. Wandered off the trail by accident, I guess. 2 of the 7 people came back. 2, a woman named Megan Finnegan, and a man named Noah Winters. Winters was in a hell of a state when the Rangers found them. Allegedly said that he had no idea where the other 5 people had gone, that they had wandered off into the night. Here's where it gets even weirder. Finnegan said that the night before they had been found, there were still 3 of them. Another guy, I think. Finnegan had been in and out of sleep, and swore that she saw Winters follow the other guy into the woods when he was going to relieve himself or something. The man never came back, but Winters did 10 minutes later. She said he looked different, thinner, taller, and insisted that he'd had blood all around his mouth. She'd felt this overwhelming fear and just pretended like she was asleep. Of course, her story was written off as delirious rambling. Marcus cleared his throat and took another swig. Something about the story just kinda gave me a genuine feeling of dread that none of this guy's other stories had quite done. Then the old bastard puts the cherry on top. A week later, the Forest Service finds remains in the woods with what were presumed to be human teeth marks on them. But they're so pulverized that they can't place exactly who they were. Winters and Finnegan are both interviewed again, but nothing comes of it. Finnegan even tells the same story and says that she knows what she saw, but they write it off again. I told the old man before closing time that night that he'd scared the hell out of me, but that I didn't believe him, and he just looked at me with this deadpan expression and said, "Look it up, son." So I did, and what do you know? It happened. Multiple different news sources covered the story. It happened was barely covered on TV. Right, I started. But Eagle Creek is huge. The surrounding area is. Noah Winters lives in Verbekivka, Dan. He runs a small farm just outside town. He fumbled around with a mess of documents on the coffee table. Megan Finnegan used to live in Verbekivka too, literally a quarter mile down the road from Winters. She'd lived here her whole life by the look of things. Are those police records? I asked. Marcus gave me an irritated side eye and continued. Point is, after she came back from that expedition, she moved 3 towns away. Packed up and left in about a week. Sold the cottage she lived in to someone who'd been on her ass about buying it for years. Her childhood home, from what I read. Whether or not Noah Winters was responsible for those people disappearing, she saw something happen in those woods that made it so she couldn't even stand to be near him. Logic struggled onwards in its ongoing battle inside my brain. It strained and strained, but superstition's blade was far too sharp. Maybe she was a whack job, I said. You know what towny folks are like. Live in the same place all their lives and... Clean bill of mental health, Marcus exclaimed, waving a crumpled medical record in my face, clearly taken from a local clinic. No history of schizophrenia, depression, BPD, or even so much as a panic attack. No prescribed medications. It's entirely possible that we could put what she saw down to hunger, dehydration, or on the off chance maybe, even the delayed effects of a hallucinogenic trip. But the fact of the matter is, this woman up and left in a matter of days after that incident. It's not like Verbekivka's right next door to Eagle Creek, either. Marcus dropped the medical record to the floor and shakily pulled up another document. He was excited or terrified or both. So look here. Her new address is in Pine Ridge. Marcus. You're chasing a roller coaster of a story here, I said. If we take this to Garland, he's gonna give us a whole spiel about how we're idiots, and then take it upon himself to rehire me just so he can fire me. We take it to Morno, and she's gonna think we're on a wild goose chase, because she's a professional who deals with career criminals in Portland and the occasional armed robbery. She's probably been with the force for 10, 12 years. Face it, Dan. Our higher-ups are stuck scratching their heads, and we might actually have a lead. I know it sounds crazy. I know it's a long shot, and it's dumb luck that I heard that story, but we may have an actual suspect. In the moment, Marcus's obsessive joining of the dots had rendered me dumbfounded, unable to think straight. So you're saying the killer is Noah Winters, Marcus blurted out. Maybe I am just another drunk idiot who wishes he was a big-shot detective, and maybe I'm completely wrong. But if there's even a chance that I'm right, we have to do something. Marcus had a point, even in the midst of his fanatical behavior. Garland didn't care, and Morno, despite leading the charge, was being eaten up by her own fear. I saw it screaming behind her eyes the night of Alina Thompson's murder. All right, what's the plan? I asked. We visit Megan Finnegan in Pine Ridge, and we ask her about Winters. What he was like, if he seemed different during or after the hiking trip, all that jazz. If we can convince her to help us beyond just talking to us, then maybe we actually have a chance at communicating it to Morno. Either that, or she chases us out of her house with a shotgun for even asking, I said dryly. Ever the pessimist, Marcus retorted. I laughed. Get some fresh clothes on, sober up, and let's get our asses to Pine Ridge. Marcus and I arrived at Megan Finnegan's residence in Pine Ridge an hour later, having backtracked along numerous roads due to the misbehaving GPS in my car. We parked across from Finnegan's house, number 12 Maple Lane. The place was not at all what I had anticipated. I had expected us to pull up next to an overgrown lawn brimming with tall weeds, and a crudely arranged patio that led up to a dingy porch with a grimy screen door. Perhaps there would have been a sign hammered onto the wall made of plywood, and scrawled on it in red paint would have been the words, "Trespassers will be shot." It was nothing like that. If anything, it was not unlike any of the other idyllic-looking houses in Pine Ridge. The lawn was a healthy burst of green, each blade of grass seemingly trimmed down to exactly the same size. And just by the curb lay a toy truck that must have belonged to a child. Marcus swept his hair out of his eyes and opened the door of the car. Well, here goes. We either get our answers or we get a door slammed in our faces. We approached the door, peering through the living room window and catching sight of a woman sitting in a reclining chair, watching a young boy of no more than 4 years of age playing on the floor. She looked up as Marcus rang the doorbell and stood up to exit the living room, motioning to the toddler to stay where he was. Megan Finnegan swung the door open, a sense of immediate irritation glinting in her eyes. She was about 35 years of age, with curly auburn hair that fell to her shoulders. Noticing her annoyance, I began to speak. "Mrs. Finnegan, Ms. I'm not married," Megan said. "Right, Ms. Finnegan," Marcus took over. "My name's Marcus Ramirez, and this is Daniel Kowalski. We don't mean to upset you, but we're cops," she snapped. Marcus was visibly surprised. "I figured. Where you from?" "Hood River." "Don't tell me you're from Portland." "Verbikivka," I said. Her glare narrowed even further. "It's our understanding that you used to live there." "Yes." "What's it to you?" "We came to inquire about." Marcus struggled over unnecessary eloquence, even though he fully expected to receive the cold shoulder. Ms. Finnegan's irritation reached its peak, and she began to shut the door. "It's about Noah Winters," Marcus finally managed. She stopped and peered through the crack between the frame and the door. Her annoyance had dissipated, and worry flooded her eyes. "You can come in," she finally said, ushering us inside. The interior of the house was as picturesque as the exterior. The staircase adorned with watercolor paintings of Oregon landscapes. The kitchen clean and well organized. Megan led us into the living room, where the boy, who I presumed to be her son, looked up at us with that wide-eyed, curious expression that is so common in young children. "Sweetie, go play in your room, okay?" Megan said to the boy. He looked down at the plastic dinosaur he was playing with, then back at his mother, before picking up the toy and sauntering down to the end of the hallway. Before Marcus or I could get a word out about how sweet her kid was, her worrisome expression returned. "I haven't seen Noah in over a year," she said. "When I moved here, he used to call my cell 5 times a week before I changed numbers. Didn't tell him I was moving here. Of course I didn't." "What the hell's he done?" "It's not what he's done," I said. "It's what we think he might have done, Ms. Finnegan," Marcus started. "Please, it's just Megan," she said softly, seeming far less vexed by our presence than she had been minutes before. "Megan," Marcus said, "the situation is this. My friend and I have reason to believe that Noah Winters may be linked to a series of violent killings in Verbikivka. However, it's little more than a hunch, and the police investigation has been a complete mess from the outset, so we need your help. It's my understanding that you knew Noah for most of your life." Megan sat down in the reclining chair, motioning for us to sit down on the couch. "My whole life, yeah. His father, David, owned this small farm by the creek near my old place, and he inherited the whole property when David passed. We were in the same grade at school. He was always a smart, knowledgeable guy, knew a whole lot about nature, and cared a lot for the environment. Could identify every mushroom and plant in the forest." She chuckled as she reminisced. "Throughout your childhood, did he ever seem off to you at any point?" I asked. "No, never. Not once did I have him pinned as the outcast or the weird kid. Everyone in high school trusted Noah. He was our go-to guide for camping trips." "I have to ask about the hiking trip," Marcus said. 5 people disappeared, and you and Noah were the only ones who came back. You moved away a week after. What the hell happened?" Megan's voice quaked as she spoke, fear mingling with the worry in her eyes. "Noah," she trailed off, straining against the painful memories to force the words out. "Noah changed on that trip. We were a week into it, and there was clearly something strange going on with him. Usually he'd be identifying plants and tracking animals, but he barely spoke, and when he did, the way he talked was fragmented and hoarse, like he'd forgotten his own native language. He seemed irritated when we tried to talk to him. He didn't talk about much, but when he did, he said, her words crumpled to the floor again. I leaned forward. What did he say, Megan? He said he was starving. An electric current surged down my spine. The silence rang in my ears like the whining aftermath of an explosion. I'd hear him at night. He'd sit out by the fire longer than anyone and mutter to himself, saying things like, God, I'm so hungry, in this voice that I'd never heard come out of him before. When it became obvious that we were lost, that's when people started disappearing. First Kelly, then Jason, then Emma, then Mark, and then Andrew the night before we were found. When Andrew disappeared, I saw Noah follow him into the forest. I didn't hear anything, but Noah came back later without him. He looked different, sickly, pale, emaciated, taller somehow. And I swear to God, he was covered in blood. I looked over at Marcus, who was staring intently at her. Maybe I was delirious, maybe I was. He looked the same as ever the next day, when the Rangers found us. I just couldn't shake this feeling that I was still in danger, though. He talked in that cracked, hoarse way still. The police paid it no mind, wrote it off as the effects of dehydration, and wrote my story off as a mirage. I moved as soon as I could when I got home. Stayed with my sister in Portland for a short while before I found a place here in Pine Ridge. Like I said, maybe I was crazy. I'm not saying Noah Winters definitely killed those people, but I am certain that something in those woods got inside of him and made itself a home. And I don't think it ever left. Marcus's intense concentration turned to slight confusion. What do you mean, something? Megan gave a half smile, as though she were embarrassed. I'm not one to believe in folk tales, Mr. Ramirez. Never have been, even when my grandpa tried to scare me to death with them, when I wasn't much older than my son. But Noah was always the same up until that trip, and he changed so suddenly. Call it what you want, a spirit, a sickness, the call of the wild, whatever. Something took a hold of Noah, took him away. I'm not saying that if you investigate him, you'll definitely find the answers you're looking for, but you might want to try. Noticing that Megan was on the verge of tears, I grabbed Marcus's arm and said, "Thank you so much for your help. We should probably get going and leave you in peace." "Megan," Marcus said tentatively, "I don't suppose we could convince you to come with us." "No," she interjected. "I can't see Noah ever again, not after what I saw in those woods. He doesn't know where I live, but I still lock every door and window at night, still watch the footage from the security camera every morning. Sometimes I think if I met him again, it would lay some ghosts to rest. But something tells me those ghosts are real damned stubborn. I can't put myself in danger. I'm the only thing that Ethan has." She motioned down the hall toward her son's bedroom. Marcus looked as though he were about to persist in his argument, but he simmered down quickly. "Thank you for your time, Megan, sincerely," Marcus said as we stood up and walked to the door. "We're gonna go give Noah a visit, and we will find out who's doing this, I promise." "Thank you," Megan replied. "Good luck." She silently watched us walk down the driveway to the car, a solemn look in her eyes. Perhaps she was reliving all those memories. Or perhaps she thought she had just sent us further into something we would regret being a part of. I looked over at the house one last time as I started the car. Through the living room window, I could make out a blurred picture of Megan cradling her son in a tender embrace. We drove. I pulled the car up to Verbikivka police station at 6:15 p.m., having convinced a particularly irate Marcus to stop off there first. I told him to wait in the car while I briefly went to talk to Garland. Apparently, he'd at the very least done a good job of rounding up the local populace for questioning. As I had to sift through a chattering crowd of townsfolk who were gathered outside and inside the station, I ran to Garland's office, rapping sharply on the door. "Who the hell is it?" came a gritty, aggravated yell. I opened the door, and my gaze met Sheriff Garland's fiery stare. "Where the hell have you been, Kowalski? Have you interviewed a man named Noah Winters?" I asked, ignoring him. "Who?" Garland said. "Noah Winters, farmer from the edge of town." "How should I know?" Garland said, taking an aggressive swig of his coffee. "Officer Blake has a checklist. Go ask her." "Now where in God's name have you been?" "You get Ramirez to pull that article." I slammed his door and ran to the front desk, where I found Officer Blake busying herself with an Excel spreadsheet. I nearly collided with the desk, startling her. "Trina," I said, letting out a long-held breath, "have you interviewed a man named Noah Winters yet?" Visibly confused by my urgency, she pulled up the records and perused them for about 10 seconds. "Oh, looks like we had him in a couple hours ago. We cleared him, he's not down as a suspect. Christ. Where's Detective Morneau?" "Cascade Locks," she said absent-mindedly. "Something came up from another case, and she left a few hours." "How long did you have Winters in the interview room for?" My words were ablaze with insistence. 5 minutes in and out," Blake replied. "You've gotta be kidding me. They didn't even ask him about the hiking trip." "Thanks," I dashed out of the station, feeling the mystified eyes of the townspeople boring into me. Marcus was waiting in anticipation, craning his neck around as I ran toward the car. I threw the door open and clambered inside. "They cleared the bastard 2 hours ago. Morneau is in Cascade Locks. We're heading to Winters's place." "Let's go," Marcus said. His tone was crawling with nerves. He had clearly expected it to come to this, but now the reality of it was sinking in. Fear brewed underneath my adrenaline rush. The sun began to exhaustedly sink below the distant mountain as we sped through Verbikivka, painting a crimson outline on the remaining clouds. The stench of dread began to creep in through the cracked passenger side window with every inch that the sun receded. I began to wish it would take longer to get to Winters's farm. Anything to stave off the terrible gut feeling. So Morneau went to Cascade Locks. "What for?" Marcus asked, obviously desperate to break the silence. Blake said it was another case. Whether or not that's a lie, I don't know and I don't care. She's shit scared and she's not here, which makes her useless, I replied. What about Garland? He wasn't even doing so much as ushering the interviewees in. Just asked me about whether or not the Daily had been convinced to pull the front page. We're on our own, Marcus. As I said that, the row of buildings on River Road disappeared, and Winters's farm came into view, sitting less than a quarter of a mile down the road from where we were. I could see a modest-looking, well-kept one-story house that sat at the head of a sprawling perhaps 3 acres of land that I assumed all belonged to Winters, as all throughout the grassland were various crops, and out behind the house stood a barn, towering proudly over the tiny abode in all of its rustic glory. Doing our utmost to compose ourselves, Marcus and I parked the car at the end of the gravel driveway, preparing for what would hopefully be our final visit of the day. We walked up to the front of the house, trepidation hanging like a meat hook on the otherwise calming summer breeze. I knocked on the screen door and squinted through the glass. From the end of the hallway emerged a man, standing about 6'2". He made a slow jog toward the screen door and pulled it open enthusiastically. He was as tan as one might expect a farmer to be, dressed in worn overalls and a red flannel shirt, and looked to be in his late 30s. He had thick brown hair that stuck out in tufts from underneath an old trucker cap, and a neatly trimmed beard. He gave a smile, his eyes glinting a little. "Can I help you fellas?" he asked, his voice a chipper, gravelly song. I was thrown off for a second. I had expected a weathered, malnourished-looking man covering his face with a wide-brimmed hat. I had expected an inhuman rasp. I had expected him to tell us to leave him alone. Marcus jumped in. "My name's off. Detective Alex Reynolds, and this is Detective Michael Foster. We're here regarding the town-wide questioning of the residents of Verbekivka." Winters chuckled nervously, his brow wrinkling. "Oh, right. There must have been some mistake. The police already interviewed me a few hours ago." "We understand, sir, and we're very sorry to trouble you," I said, joining Marcus in playing the role of Detective Foster. "See," Marcus said, "it's a big operation, and the Verbekivka Police Department are swamped, as you might imagine. Unfortunately, they missed a couple of vital questions when interviewing a few people, and they've sent us round to get extra details." "Oh, right, of course," Winters said, his expression softening a little. "By all means, come on inside." Marcus and I stepped into the hallway as Winters closed the door. Inside, the temperature was cool, yet an unpleasant smell sat in the air. I heard the door lock behind us. Had the door been locked before? I couldn't remember. "Hope you fellows'll forgive me for the smell," he laughed. "Got a possum problem at the moment, and the critters keep dying in the walls and underneath the floorboards. I try to keep the stench away as best I can till I can dig 'em out." "Right on, man," I said, humoring his conversation. "Had a problem with possums myself about a month ago." Winters led us to his kitchen, which seemed to be the biggest and most impressive room in the otherwise small house, with a large wooden counter spanning its entire length, and a gleaming butcher block sitting in the middle. On the counter was a hefty pile of raw meat. "Jesus," I remarked. "That all from your farm?" "Yes, sir," Winters exclaimed with pride. "All locally sourced from right here. The butcher shops downtown love this stuff." "I'll bet," I said. "Now, Mr. Winters, you mind if Detective Reynolds and I ask you some questions?" "Shouldn't take long, sure." "Have a seat," Winters said, gesturing to the kitchen table. He leaned against the counter, turning his attention to the pile of meat. He still hadn't asked to see our badges. "I'm listin' in, gentlemen." "Fire away." "Verbekivka station clocks your interview at about 5 minutes, correct?" I asked. "Yeah, real quick in and out. Think they wrote me off because, well, I don't have a record, and I mean, look at this place." I'm busy all the time. Ain't got family to help me around the farm, Winters replied. Of course, as far as criminal charges go, your record's completely clean, mister. Winters, Marcus said. Winters picked up a meat cleaver and began hacking at the steak. The instrument came down with a resounding thwack, separating a piece of the animal's flesh from the rest of the flank. I suppose we're here to ask about the hiking trip you took in May of 2011 with a party of 6 other people, I said. Winters exhaled loudly as though he were sighing. However, he didn't turn around or stop what he was doing. The cleaver came down again, louder this time. Oh, of course. I was a little surprised myself that they didn't ask. Well, let's start with a general question, I began. What happened? What's your story, huh? Got lost on the 5th day of the trip. We'd intended it to be a long trip anyhow, but we ended up having a hell of a time finding the trail back and found ourselves lost in the woods with no idea which direction we were supposed to go. Kelly disappeared on the first night that we got lost. He paused, falling into a reminiscent chasm for just a moment. And did you know Kelly well? Marcus asked. Known her since high school. We were close. Real close. There was a pain in his voice. I'm sorry, I said. That must have been Diff. I was cut off by the startling sound of the cleaver making contact with the cutting board, slicing cleanly through another piece of meat. Much louder than before. Yeah, I try not to think about it. It got hazy after that, real hazy. There was this pain. It sounded like he was struggling through his sentences now. Pain, I asked. Started in my head. Clouded my vision. How long did the pain go on for? Marcus asked. The electric current I had felt in Megan's living room sprung to life again. It was like a blade this time, grazing my spine with serrated teeth. I thought I had become accustomed to the stink of the dead rodents, but I knew what that smelled like. This was something different, something that carried a far more bitter scent. Hope you fellows'll forgive me for the smell. 2 days, spread to my stomach and chest. Felt numb after that. And then, I guess I felt good, Winters said, his voice assuming a strange, grating quality. He brought the cleaver down again, the abrasive thud accompanied by the wet sound of tearing meat. Winters turned around to look at us. He seemed paler than he had before, his posture slightly crooked. The glint in his eyes was gone. What do you remember about the disappearance of Andrew Phillips the night before you were rescued? I inquired. He paused, setting the cleaver down. Had I blacked out? His cheekbones now seemed sunken. His eyes were even darker. His fingers were freakishly long and thin. An eerie silence waltzed with the tension that had clouded the kitchen. It was just animals at first. His voice was a sickly rasp. What, when I came back from the trip? It was just animals, rabbits, deer, raccoons. Then stray dogs. What the hell are you talking about? My mouth was dry. The stinging scent of decomposition couldn't be ignored. It was just animals until the feeling came back. There was something in those woods, boys. Something that called to me. Something that wouldn't let me die. Something that told me. His eyes were cold black pits. His teeth were unnaturally long, forming yellow daggers in his mouth and forcing his face into a mocking grin. Marcus stood up, backing away. Told you what, mister? Winters, something that told me to eat, Winters finally said. Despite his unnatural tone, his voice was somehow cold, matter of fact. I killed the people on that hiking trip. I knew all of them, and I killed them and ate their flesh, Winters said. Why, Marcus could hardly speak. I tried eating animals and raw meat until that. Feeling came back, he began circling the table. That's when I began breaking into houses. People I didn't know. People I did know, some I liked, some I didn't care for. I tore them all apart. I stood up and stumbled away next to Marcus as Noah Winters stalked toward us, his sharp canines protruding. Why are you telling us this? Because his icy tone slowly began to thaw. They can do what they like with me now. They can fry me. They can commit me as another criminally insane nut. Because they think they can control me like every other guy that went out and killed young women because daddy was too rough on them. It helps them sleep at night to know that those sick bastards are all just human beings that they can control, one way or another. But this hunger inside me, this power, a thick rope of drool fell from his mouth and pooled on the floor. There are things darker than man in this world, boys. In the soil, in the mountains, in the trees, in some dark corner of a big city. It might make you feel better to believe that other people are the cruelest thing this life has to offer, but I'm afraid that just isn't true. Winters's mouth was unnaturally wide, the bed of spikes inside no longer resembling anything remotely human. A small glimmer sat in the center of his black eyes, like a tiny, brilliant star inside a black hole. Hunger. Marcus and I dived in opposite directions as Winters lunged at both of us, an animalistic howl erupting from his throat. I heard a chair collide with the counter as I scrambled to my feet, coming face to face with the creature that had been, or still was, Noah Winters. Any disbelief I had could not be justified. This nightmarish picture was here in front of me, and it was very, very real. Just as his maw opened again, and another monstrous groan emitted from within him. A gunshot rang out, and Winters doubled over in pain, screeching with the ferocity of 1,000 banshees. Marcus stood behind him, his pistol drawn. Winters twitched violently, the motion producing a sickening crunch, as though one of his bones had broken. Without a moment's hesitation, Winters jumped from the floor to the ceiling and took off down the hallway to what I had assumed to be the staircase to the cellar, skittering like an insect. His harrowing howl echoed through the house like another angry gust of wind. Drawing my own weapon, Marcus and I gave chase. The door to the cellar hung wide open, and any vaguely pleasant smells in the house were now being eaten alive by the very clear aura of death. This wasn't the smell of a possum problem, that was for sure. For about 10 seconds, the house resounded with clattering and screaming coming up from the cellar. And as soon as it had begun, it suddenly ceased. Dead silence. I exchanged a terrified glance with Marcus. I wish I was still drunk, Marcus grumbled shakily. We cautiously crept down the stairs to the cellar, the light dwindling more and more with each step. My hands were gripping the pistol so hard that my knuckles had turned white, and an oasis of sweat had sprung from my palms. Marcus fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a flashlight, turning it on and allowing the beam to illuminate the pitch blackness. The beam pierced the void that sat in the doorway, creating a tunnel of light that led our eyes to a sight that confirmed what I had feared the moment that smell had hit me. The floor of the cellar was piled with remains of all kinds: animal, human, arms, legs, internal organs. Some had clearly been dragged down here no more than a few days ago, and some were weeks, maybe even months old, left on the ground to decay and denied a real burial. A shuffling sound from off to the left grabbed our attention, and Winters stepped back into view, his metamorphosis having advanced even further. He stood well over 7 feet tall, his rib cage protruding as though his skin were vacuum packed around it. His face was now ghoulishly inhuman, his eyes like hollow pits and his teeth like battle-scarred tusks. Noah Winters perched like a gargoyle atop his morbid spoils, a king of the dead in his hall of treasures. He spoke, a baritone growl sitting underneath his strangled voice. "Sorry. The refrigerator down here is." Broken, a sick smile spread across his face, and it was enough to tip Marcus and I over the edge. We just started shooting, and we kept on shooting until both of our weapons had completely run out of bullets. When our eyes were no longer obscured by the obnoxious muzzle flashes, the flashlight fell on what was seemingly the lifeless corpse of the beast that Noah Winters had turned into. We were both shocked, having expected him to attempt to flee the cellar or at least jump out of the way. The twisted monster now lay still among his quarries. The entire Verbikivka police department arrived half an hour later, and the deeply panicked, white-faced Detective Morneau arrived another half hour after that. The whole cleanup operation took the best part of an entire week. But that first night was a harrowing ordeal, even for those who didn't have to scrape up the remains or lay eyes on the creature that was responsible. If it had been any other case, I would have relished the look of horror on Sheriff Garland's face when he knew quite how badly he had handled everything, and the realization that he would have to deal with those bureau boys when a black SUV pulled up outside the crime scene. The expression on his face was one shared by everyone who had to wrap their heads around the fact that the near 8-foot-tall monster that was dragged out of that cellar had been, at one point, Noah Winters. I was glad that the case had been closed, but I felt very little in the way of catharsis. Marcus and I had come face to face with the unknown, and the unknown had filled our heads with something unforgettable. There are things darker than man out there, things we can't control the way we can control the Bundys and Dahmers of the world. We may have put an end to Noah Winters's otherwise never-ending hunger, but whatever was inside him is still tearing its way through the forests and the mountains, searching for another viable host to infect with the burning rage it carries with it. I'm not so sure that we can always fight what we don't understand. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.